The day Sophia Bennett's convoy of black SUVs rolled into Cedar Creek, every curtain on Maple Street twitched. Nobody came to this town for anything good. And nobody pulled up to Ryan Walker's garage in a fleet of vehicles that cost more than every house on the block combined. Ryan had grease under his fingernails, a leaking roof over his head, and a reputation that could be summed up in 3 words the locals loved to repeat: the junk mechanic. But Sophia wasn't here by accident. She'd been looking for him for 7 months. If you've ever been counted out by the people closest to you, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Like the video, and let's begin. The first frost of the season came early that year. It crept in overnight, silvering the dead grass along Route 9 and turning the puddles in Ryan Walker's driveway into thin, cracked mirrors that his boots broke through every morning on the way to unlock the garage. He'd been meaning to fix the driveway for 2 years. He'd been meaning to fix a lot of things. At 6:14 a.m., while the rest of Cedar Creek was still asleep, Ryan was already at his workbench. The garage smelled the way it always did: motor oil and cold metal and something vaguely chemical that he could no longer identify, having lived with it so long. A single utility light hung from a cord above the bench, casting everything in that specific shade of yellow that made new things look old and old things look ancient. Along the far wall, shelves sagged under the weight of salvaged components: compressor housings, copper tubing coiled like sleeping snakes, fans missing half their blades, circuit boards he'd pulled from printers and refrigerators, and once, a decommissioned vending machine someone had left at the end of the town dump road with a sign that said, "Free," broken. He never passed a free, broken sign without stopping. His daughter Emma called it a sickness. She was 9 years old and already more practical than he'd ever been. "Daddy, why do we need the insides of a broken soda machine?" "We don't need it yet," he'd told her. "That's not an answer. It'll make sense later." She'd given him the look, the one she'd apparently inherited from her mother. A look that said, "I love you, but I genuinely cannot explain you to other people," and climbed back into the truck. Ryan smiled at nothing in particular, tightened a clamp on the prototype sitting in front of him, and checked the temperature gauge mounted to its side. The reading made him pause. He wrote the number down in the spiral notebook that lived beside his coffee thermos, permanently bloated from having been left open in the humidity too many times. Then he adjusted a valve by a quarter turn, waited, and checked the gauge again. The number had moved. Not much, but it had moved in the right direction. He wrote that down too. The town of Cedar Creek sat in a particular kind of American nowhere, not remote enough to be scenic, not close enough to anything to be convenient. It was the kind of place people mentioned when explaining where they were from, always with a slight apologetic dip in the voice. Population 4,200 on a good census year with 1 traffic light, 2 diners, a hardware store that had been going out of business for as long as anyone could remember, and the particular communal memory that small towns cultivate about their residents: rich, detailed, and almost entirely unfair. Ryan Walker's communal memory went something like this: smart kid, scholarship to state. Father got sick, came home to help. Never went back. Had a daughter with Carla Myers. The 2 of them married young and badly, divorced by the time Emma was 2. Carla moved to Phoenix with a realtor. Ryan got the kid in the garage his father had left him, which by most accounts was the lesser prize of the settlement. Spent the next 7 years doing oil changes, tire rotations, and collecting what most people in town referred to as junk. Doug Heller, who owned the auto parts store 3 blocks over and considered himself something of a community historian, had the most efficient summary. "Ryan Walker's a smart guy who made dumb choices and now plays with trash in his garage. Shame, really." Doug said this with genuine sympathy, which somehow made it worse. The mockery was rarely cruel in the traditional sense. Cedar Creek wasn't that kind of town. It was more like the low-grade, background radiation kind of dismissal. The way people's voices changed when they talked to Ryan versus about Ryan. The way invitations to things subtly stopped arriving. The way his business had thinned from steady to sporadic, to the occasional walk-in who was either desperate or unaware of the unspoken consensus that Ryan Walker's garage was a last resort. He was aware of all of it. He'd stopped being angry about it somewhere around year 4 or 5. What replaced the anger was harder to name. Not quite acceptance, not quite indifference. more like a quiet decision to stop measuring his life by what Cedar Creek thought of it. Most days that decision held. Some days it didn't. By 7:30 a.m., Emma was awake. He heard her before he saw her. The particular rhythm of her feet on the kitchen floor that he'd memorized the way musicians memorize time signatures. Then the back door opened and she appeared in the garage doorway wearing her school clothes under his old flannel jacket, which hit her at the knees and made her look approximately 6 years old despite being 9 and increasingly determined to seem 12. She was holding 2 mugs. "Your coffee's cold," she announced. "How do you know?" "Because you've been out here since before I woke up and you always forget to drink it." She crossed the garage, navigating the organized chaos with the familiarity of a child who'd grown up in it, and set the fresh mug beside his notebook. She looked at the prototype on the workbench. "Did it work?" "Getting closer." "You've been getting closer for 8 months." "Yeah, well." He picked up the mug. "Some things take longer than you think they will." Emma looked at the temperature gauge, then at the notebook, with an expression of polite skepticism that, again, had not come from him. "Mrs. Patterson says you're coming in for Career Day next month." Ryan had forgotten about Career Day. "What am I supposed to talk about?" "Being a mechanic, I guess." Emma picked up a small copper fitting from the bench and turned it over in her fingers with the casual curiosity of a kid who'd been surrounded by mechanical parts her entire life. "Tommy Briggs's dad is talking about being a lawyer. Caitlin's mom is a nurse. Mechanics are important." "I know." She set this fitting down carefully, in the exact spot she'd taken it from. She knew where things went. She'd learned early that misplaced parts caused actual problems. "I just meant, are you going to talk about this?" She gestured at the prototype. "The cooling thing?" Ryan was quiet for a second. "I don't know that there's much to say about it yet." "There's a lot to say about it. You just don't want to say it to people who'll laugh." 9 years old. It was genuinely alarming sometimes. "Go eat breakfast," he said. She went, but she paused at the door and turned back, the oversized flannel making her look like a small person wearing a different small person. "I don't think it's junk, you know, what you're building." "I know you don't." "I think it's going to work." He didn't say anything to that. She left. He looked at the temperature gauge for a long time. Then he picked up his notebook and kept going. Here's something Ryan had never told anyone, including Emma, including the therapist he'd seen exactly twice after the divorce, before deciding he couldn't afford it. He had almost been an aerospace engineer. Not almost in the way people say it loosely. "I almost became a doctor," meaning they once took a biology class and found it interesting. Almost in the precise technical sense that he had been accepted to the aerospace engineering program at State on a partial merit scholarship, had registered for classes, had purchased 2 textbooks and a scientific calculator that he still owned and still used, and had been planning to move into the dormitories on a Tuesday in September when his mother called to tell him his father had had a stroke. He deferred enrollment, then deferred again, then watched the deferral window close. His father recovered, mostly, but the recovery took 2 years and cost the family savings and required someone to keep the garage running, and that someone had been Ryan. By the time things stabilized, he was 23, the scholarship was long gone, and re-entry felt less like a door and more like a wall. He'd stood in front of that wall for a while. Then he'd turned around and gotten on with things. What he hadn't done, what he was constitutionally incapable of doing, it seemed, was stop studying. The engineering textbooks accumulated the way the salvaged parts did, slowly, steadily, with a logic that was clear to him and opaque to everyone else. Fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, heat transfer, materials science. He read them the way other people watched television, in the evenings after Emma was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp with a cup of coffee that also went cold, working through problems in the margins of notebooks with the focused, slightly fevered concentration of someone who understood that they were behind and had decided not to care. He watched online lectures from universities that hadn't accepted him, and took notes on concepts from researchers whose names appeared in papers he'd never be assigned. He subscribed to 2 engineering journals, the kind with academic abstracts and dry, technical language, and read them cover to cover even when he understood only 70% and had to look up the rest. Cedar Creek thought he was collecting junk. He was collecting an education. The cooling system had started as a thought experiment, a nagging, recurring thought that something about conventional thermal management, the way machines handled heat, the way they dissipated it, the way industrial equipment burned through components, because nobody had found a sufficiently elegant solution to the problem of moving heat efficiently from point A to point B, was being approached from the wrong direction. Not wrong in an obvious way. Wrong in the way that seems obvious only after someone points it out. The kind of wrong that entire industries can sustain for decades, because everyone working in those industries learned the same foundational assumptions, and none of them ever stepped back far enough to question them. Ryan had stepped back, partly because he had no choice. He was working outside every professional framework, with no colleagues, no lab, no institutional knowledge telling him what was impossible. He'd approached the problem like a man with nothing to lose, which, in certain respects, was exactly what he was. The first real prototype had been built from a broken car air conditioning unit, a section of copper pipe, and a heat exchanger he'd salvaged from a discarded commercial refrigeration system. It had been ugly and impractical, and had leaked refrigerant badly enough to send him out of the garage coughing. But the core thermal transfer readings had been interesting. Interesting became compelling. Compelling became 6 subsequent prototypes and 18 months and a wall of notebooks and nights, when he sat at the bench until 3 a.m. running tests while Cedar Creek slept and the frost built up on the garage windows and the temperature gauge did things it probably shouldn't have been doing according to everything he'd been taught. He didn't tell anyone about it. This was partly habit. He'd long since stopped volunteering information about his projects to people who had demonstrated they would respond with barely concealed condescension. It was also, if he was honest, fear. Fear that talking about it would break whatever careful private momentum had built up. That words would make it real in the wrong direction. Not real like this is actually working, but real like this is a thing I can be laughed at for. He'd been laughed at enough. So he kept the notebooks. He kept the late nights. He kept the temperature gauge readings in the bloated spiral notebook beside the cold coffee. And he kept getting closer. The thing about small-town reputation is that it compounds. When you are, say, a mechanic running a struggling garage, the logic of the reputation becomes self-fulfilling. People know the garage is struggling, so they take their cars elsewhere, so the garage struggles more, which confirms what people knew. The reputation creates the reality it claims to merely describe. For Ryan, the compound interest on his reputation had been accumulating for years. There were specific moments he remembered. The Tuesday afternoon he'd run into Dave Kowalski, whose family owned the town's largest construction company, at the hardware store. Dave had been cordial, the way people are cordial to someone they feel sorry for. He'd asked how the garage was going. Ryan had just mentioned, not pitched, not requested anything, that he was working on some engineering projects in his spare time. Dave's face had done a thing, a careful, controlled thing that was trying to be polite and neutral, but wasn't quite managing it. "Oh yeah?" he'd said. "Like, what kind of projects?" "Thermal management systems. Heat dissipation." There had been a pause of approximately 2 seconds that contained approximately 14 different social calculations. "Huh," Dave said. "Well, that's good for you, man. Good to have hobbies." Hobbies. Ryan had bought his screws and gone home. Then there was the conversation he'd overheard at Patty's diner. The kind of conversation people have when they think they're being quiet enough, which they never are. 2 women from the school board sipping coffee in the corner booth. "Emma Walker is a bright girl." "She is. Sweet kid. Shame about the home situation. I mean, Ryan's not a bad father." "No, I know, but..." A pause. "What's she coming home to, you know? Man who barely keeps the lights on, spending all his time in that garage with his, I don't know what you'd call it, projects. I heard he told someone he was an engineer once." A small, sympathetic laugh. "He was going to school for it years ago." "Well," another pause, the kind that finishes sentences without needing words. Ryan had paid his bill and left before his food arrived. He'd sat in the truck for a few minutes after that, not crying. He wasn't going to pretend it was that dramatic. Just sitting, letting the particular exhaustion of that kind of moment move through him. The exhaustion of being seen as a version of yourself that is smaller and sadder and more finished than the one you actually are. Then he'd driven home, gone to the garage, opened the notebook, and kept working. This was, as far as he could tell, the only response that made any sense. It happened on a Wednesday in November. Emma had a cold and had gone to bed early after dinner, which meant Ryan was alone in the garage by 8 o'clock, earlier than usual, with more uninterrupted time than he usually got on a weekday. He'd made coffee with actual attention to it for once, and settled at the bench with his notebook spread open. He'd been stuck for 3 weeks. The problem was specific. The current prototype's cooling efficiency dropped significantly at higher operational temperatures, which made it impractical for the heavy-duty aerospace and industrial applications he'd been theorizing about. He'd tested 8 different configurations. None of them had solved it. 2 had made it worse. He had pages of calculations leading to walls, and he'd begun to develop the particular specific dread of a man who suspects that the problem he's trying to solve might be the kind that doesn't have a solution. That night, he wasn't even trying to solve it. He was just reviewing old notebooks, going back through the early work, the first prototype's data, the original thought experiment that had started all of this. Sometimes going backward helped. Sometimes seeing where you'd started reminded you of something you'd understood intuitively before the more complicated work had buried it. He was on the 3rd notebook when he stopped. There was a page of calculations from almost 2 years ago, early in the project, before he'd gotten deep into the engineering specifics. The numbers were rougher, the approach more instinctive. He'd been working from a principle he'd half remembered from a thermodynamics paper, combined with something he'd observed in the behavior of the copper heat exchanger from the old refrigeration unit, combined with, and this was the part that made him sit up straighter now, a diagram he'd sketched based on the arrangement of cooling vanes in a biological system. He'd actually looked up insect thermoregulation at some point. He couldn't remember exactly when or why. Probably a late-night research spiral of the kind he was prone to. Dragonflies, specifically, had an unusual circulatory arrangement for heat management that he'd found interesting. He'd sketched it in the margin, noted a few properties, and moved on. He was looking at that sketch now. And he was looking at the diagram of his current prototype's thermal pathway. And something in the arrangement of those 2 images, the biological and the mechanical, sitting on pages 2 years apart, clicked in a way that was almost audible. His pencil was moving before he fully understood what he was doing. The idea was about pathway geometry. Not the materials, not the flow rate, not any of the variables he'd been obsessively adjusting for 3 weeks. The shape of the thermal pathway. The way heat moved through the system wasn't just a function of the medium, it was a function of the route. And there was a geometric arrangement. He was scribbling it out now, the pencil moving fast, his coffee going cold beside him, that would allow the system to maintain efficiency at higher temperatures by distributing the thermal load across multiple simultaneous pathways rather than a single sequential one. It was not exactly a new concept. Multipathway heat transfer existed in engineering, but the specific geometry he was working out, the arrangement and proportions, and the way it interacted with the particular materials he'd been using, this was something he hadn't seen. Not in any paper he'd read, not in any system he'd studied. He stayed at the bench until 2:17 a.m. When he finally stopped, his hand ached from writing. The garage had gotten cold enough that he could see his breath. And there were 11 pages of dense calculations and diagrams in the notebook. He read through them 3 times, looking for the mistake. Every calculation he'd done in the last 2 years had contained at least one mistake at first pass. It was part of the process. The initial insight was always impure, required correction, required the cold, hard light of critical review. He could not find a mistake. He sat back in his chair and looked at the garage ceiling for a while. Water stain above the left shelf, crack in the paneling above the window. Light fixture that buzzed on cold mornings. He'd looked at this ceiling thousands of times. It might actually work, he thought, not might work in the cautious way he'd thought it before. Hedged, qualified, protected from disappointment. This felt different, more solid. The kind of conviction that sat in your chest and didn't move when you pushed on it. He closed the notebook. He turned off the bench light. He went inside, checked that Emma was asleep, stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark, and felt something he didn't have an exact word for. A complicated, frightened, exhausted kind of hope. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. The next 3 months were the hardest of the project, and also, in a specific way Ryan could only recognize in retrospect, the most alive he'd felt in years. He'd built his initial proof-of-concept model in 2 weeks, working every night after Emma was in bed and on weekend mornings while she watched television with the focused absorption of a child happy to be left alone with a screen. The model was crude, salvaged materials, imprecise fittings, the kind of construction that any professional engineer would have looked at with polite horror. But the thermal readings were real, and the readings were extraordinary. The efficiency numbers were, he checked them 4 times before he allowed himself to believe them, significantly higher than anything in the existing literature he'd studied. At operational temperatures well above what conventional systems could sustain without degradation, the new geometry maintained its performance. Not perfectly. There were fluctuations, anomalies, a recurring pressure inconsistency in the third pathway that appeared at specific temperature thresholds and had cost him 2 weeks of troubleshooting. But the core principle held. It held. He refined the model, then refined it again. He taught himself more advanced simulation techniques from YouTube tutorials recorded by graduate students at universities he'd never attended, worked the simulations against his physical tests, found where they diverged, and used the divergences to improve the design. He failed, in specific technical terms, repeatedly. Prototype 4 had a catastrophic seal failure that sent coolant across the workbench and soaked 3 of his notebooks. He'd had to let the notebooks dry out for 2 days before he could read them, and even then some pages were stuck together and several calculations were illegible. He'd rewritten them from memory, which was how he discovered he'd had a minor arithmetic error in the 3rd notebook all along, one that had been propagating through subsequent calculations. Fixing it actually improved the efficiency model. Prototype 6 had an issue with material fatigue in one of the pathway joints. It held fine at room temperature, then developed a hairline crack under thermal stress that he missed during inspection and only discovered when the system pressure dropped unexpectedly during a test. He'd been lucky. The crack could have caused a rupture that would have, at minimum, destroyed the prototype and, at maximum, taken out the bench and possibly started a fire. He'd stood looking at the hairline crack for a long time after he found it. "You want me to come in after school and help?" Emma had asked that morning, watching him drink cold coffee with the particular watchfulness she'd developed around his harder stretches. "No, I'm good." "You're not sleeping enough." "I'm sleeping." "Daddy, I can hear you up at 2 a.m. "Sound travels weird in this house." She gave him the look. He looked back. They had, over 9 years, developed a form of communication that mostly bypassed words. "I'm close," he said. "I think I'm actually close." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." She picked up her backpack. "But if you blow up the garage, we're going to have a problem." He laughed. The first real laugh he'd had in weeks, probably. After she left, he went back to the bench and fixed the joint. 7 months before the black SUVs showed up in his driveway, Ryan did something impulsive. He just finished a successful test of Prototype 7, the best test yet, readings that held through a full 2-hour thermal cycle with none of the pressure anomalies that had plagued the earlier versions. He'd been sitting at the bench at midnight, alone in the cold garage, looking at numbers that he was fairly certain were exceptional, and with nobody in the world to show them to. Emma was asleep. He had no colleagues. His friends from his pre-garage years had, through the natural attrition of different life trajectories, mostly dispersed into other existences. There was nobody to call. He opened his laptop. He'd been on engineering forums before, lurking mostly, occasionally asking technical questions under a username that wasn't his name. He'd found communities of people who talked seriously about the things he cared about, people doing real work in real institutions, and he'd found it both useful and, if he was honest, a little painful, in the way that watching other people live a life you wanted for yourself can be. That night, on impulse, he started writing. He wrote a technical paper, or something that approximated a technical paper. He'd read enough of them to know the format, and he'd been thinking about this work long enough to have a lot to say. He wrote about the geometric pathway concept, about the biological systems that had inspired it, about the thermal efficiency data he'd collected. He included diagrams. He included the relevant calculations. He was careful and precise and stayed up until 3 in the morning writing and rewriting. Then he posted it to a niche engineering forum under his usual anonymous username, titled it, "An Unconventional Geometric Approach to High-Temperature Thermal Pathway Efficiency," and went to bed. He didn't check the forum for 2 weeks. When he finally did, The post had 47 replies and had been shared to 2 other forums he wasn't on. Most of the replies were skeptical, some were dismissive. A handful, 3 or 4, were written by people who had clearly read the paper carefully and whose questions were the kind that only someone who understood the material could ask. Those replies made Ryan's hands shake slightly as he typed responses. He responded to every serious question. He posted a follow-up with additional data. Then life got busy. A rush of car repairs, Emma's school play, a 3-day stretch where the garage roof started leaking again and had to be managed with strategically placed buckets, and increasingly desperate calls to a roofer who kept not showing up. And he stopped checking the forum. He had no idea that someone had taken the paper seriously. He had no idea that someone had been looking for him. The roofer finally showed up the Tuesday before Sophia Bennett's convoy arrived. His name was Pete, and he was apologetic about the delays in the specific way of a man who'd been in the apologizing business long enough to do it without it costing him anything. He walked around the garage roof, made sounds that expressed professional concern without professional commitment, and gave Ryan a number that made Ryan set down the mug he was holding. "That's for patching," Pete said, "not replacing."
"I understood what you said. It's just, the flashing's bad, and there's wood rot along the—" "I understood." Ryan looked at the roof. The roof looked back. "Can you patch the worst of it for now?" "Sure, but you're going to keep having problems." "Yeah," Ryan said. "I know."
After Pete left, Ryan stood in the garage and did the math he'd done before. The recurring calculation he'd been running for 2 years now. How much the garage made, how much living cost, how much Emma's things cost, how much the garage needed in repairs, how much was in the account. The math never came out differently. It was the kind of math that produced the same answer, regardless of how carefully you did it. Not enough. He sat down on the stool beside the bench. The prototype sat in front of him, clean and functional, its temperature gauge reading ambient. Outside, the October air was doing the thing it did in Cedar Creek, sharp and gray, and smelling faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. He thought about the forum post. He thought about the 3 or 4 people who'd asked intelligent questions that he'd answered and then never heard from again. He thought about the patent he'd looked into. Once, briefly, and the cost of which had been one more number in the calculation that didn't come out right. He picked up his notebook. He looked at the numbers. He kept working. It was a Friday. Emma had gone to school. Ryan had been under the hood of a 2011 Dodge pickup for 90 minutes, replacing an intake manifold gasket for a customer who'd asked twice whether the price was firm and who Ryan had quoted $50 less than he should have because he was constitutionally incapable of hard bargaining. The radio in the corner was playing country music he wasn't listening to. His hands were black with grease. He heard the vehicles before he saw them. The sound was specific, not one engine but several, moving together at the measured pace of a procession rather than the ordinary randomness of traffic on a residential street. He came out from under the hood without thinking about it, the way you come up out of water when you hear something unexpected. Stood at the garage doorway. 3 black SUVs were turning into his driveway. His driveway was not set up for 3 black SUVs. The first one made it fine. The second one was tight. The third one clipped the corner of the fence post that marked the driveway's edge, though it moved with such deliberate slowness that the clip was gentle. More a statement about the fence post's inadequacy than any fault of the driver. Ryan wiped his hands on the shop rag. The gesture was automatic. The rag was not particularly clean. The lead SUV's door opened. A woman stepped out first. She was around his age, maybe a year or 2 younger. He'd learn later that she was 30, and she was dressed in the way that people who have actual meetings in actual buildings dress. A dark coat over what appeared to be professional clothes, the kind of outfit that didn't acknowledge the existence of a town like Cedar Creek. She had a tablet in one hand and was looking at something on it as she walked. Behind her, other doors were opening, and men and women were stepping out with laptops and portfolios and the general organized, purposeful energy of people who worked for someone who moved fast. The woman looked up from her tablet. She looked at the garage. She looked at Ryan. She looked at the grease on his hands and the shop rag he was holding and the 2011 Dodge pickup with its hood up and the cluttered interior of the garage visible behind him. Then she walked toward him with the direct, no-preamble stride of someone who'd been wanting to find something for a long time and had finally found it. "Ryan Walker?" she said. He looked at the 3 SUVs, the team of people, the October morning that had not started like this. Yeah, he said. She held out her hand. Her grip was firm and dry. Sophia Bennett. I've been looking for you for 7 months. She glanced past him at the workbench, at the prototype visible in the interior light of the garage. I think you've built something extraordinary. Can I come in? Ryan looked down at his grease-stained hands. He looked at the shop rag. He looked at this woman who had arrived with a team and a fleet of vehicles and the settled certainty of someone who did not show up to places by accident. He started, stopped, started again. The place is kind of a mess. I've seen the paper, she said. Her voice was direct without being sharp. I'm not here about the mess. From somewhere down Maple Street, Ryan could see a curtain move. He stepped back from the doorway. Okay, he said. Come in. Sophia Bennett stepped into Ryan Walker's garage the way most people step into a place that surprises them. A half-second pause at the threshold, a quick read of the room, then forward. She didn't make a face about the smell or the clutter. Ryan noticed that. He'd had customers walk in for the first time and immediately produce an expression that communicated, without words, that they were revising their opinion of the situation. Sophia just looked. Her eyes moved from the shelves to the workbench to the prototype sitting under the utility light, and her expression was the focused, unsentimental kind of attention that belonged to someone running calculations. Her team followed her in. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, all carrying either laptops or portfolios or both, all dressed in the same general vocabulary of professional purposefulness. They arranged themselves in the available space with the practiced efficiency of people who regularly had to be useful in rooms that weren't designed for them. Ryan put the shop rag down on the edge of the workbench and tried to remember when he'd last swept the floor. The answer was probably Thursday of last week, which wasn't terrible, but the intake manifold job had spread components across most of the available surface area, and there was a coffee cup he'd been using as a parts tray since Tuesday. You want... He looked around. There was one actual chair in the garage, which was at the workbench. I don't have a lot of seating. We're fine standing, Sophia said. She was already looking at the prototype. Not casually, looking at it the way you look at something when you're trying to decide whether what you've been told about it matches what you're seeing. Is this the current version? 7th iteration. The one I described in the paper was the 6th. I've made some changes since. What kind of changes? He moved to the workbench. The proximity to the prototype made him feel steadier. This was his territory, his language. The pressure inconsistency I mentioned in the original write-up, 3rd pathway, high temperature threshold. I was getting a cyclic variance of about 4% that was manageable but not acceptable for any real-world application. He pointed to a section of the system where the pathway geometry changed configuration. I modified the junction geometry here, changed the angle of intersection, and added a secondary microchannel that acts as a pressure buffer. It dropped the variance to under 0.5%. One of the engineers, a man in his late 30s with the look of someone who'd spent considerable time around technical systems, had moved closer without Ryan noticing. He was looking at the junction. You machined this yourself? That section, yeah. The fitting wasn't available commercially in the dimensions I needed. The engineer and Sophia exchanged a look. Ryan caught it. He couldn't fully read it. How did you test the variance reduction? Sophia asked. I built a thermal cycling rig. He moved to the shelves along the back wall and pulled out a wooden box that contained, loosely organized, a collection of data logs, temperature readings, pressure readings, cycle records, each labeled by date in his handwriting. He set the box on the workbench. I ran 214 thermal cycles over about 6 weeks. Full data's in here. Sophia looked at the box, then at him. 214. Give or take. Some tests I ran twice because I thought the sensor was reading wrong. He paused. It usually wasn't. She picked up one of the logs, read it, handed it to the engineer who'd been looking at the junction, who read it with the speed of someone for whom data tables were a native language. He handed it to one of the others. The garage was quiet for a moment, except for the country radio in the corner, which Ryan now intensely wished he'd turned off. Can I ask you something? Sophia said. Go ahead. The geometric pathway concept, the biological inspiration. The paper mentioned dragonfly thermoregulation but didn't go into detail. How did you get from insect circulatory biology to this specific arrangement? It was a good question. It was, in fact, exactly the right question. The kind that cut to the actual conceptual core of the work, rather than circling the technical details. Ryan looked at her for a second, recalibrating. He'd expected more skepticism in the early questions, more of the careful, polite probing that was really just looking for the exit. I wasn't trying to replicate the biology, he said. That would have been the wrong approach. Biological systems optimize for things that are irrelevant in mechanical applications. What I was looking at was the underlying geometry of the vein arrangement, the distribution pattern. Dragonflies manage significant heat production during flight with a vascular structure that distributes thermal load across multiple simultaneous pathways rather than routing it sequentially. The reason that's interesting mechanically isn't the biology. It's that the geometry allows for what I'd call adaptive load balancing. The system doesn't need to solve the heat problem at any single point because it's continuously redistributing it across the network. He stopped. He was aware that he'd been talking for a while and that the 4 engineers in his garage had gone very still. The insight, he continued more carefully, was that conventional thermal pathway design is almost entirely sequential. Heat moves from A to B to C. There are good reasons for that. It's predictable, it's controllable, it's easy to model, but it creates a bottleneck problem at high temperatures. My geometry distributes simultaneously. It's harder to model, harder to control, but it eliminates the bottleneck. Sophia had been watching him the way he sometimes watched the temperature gauge, with the specific quality of attention you give something when you're waiting to see if it confirms what you think it's going to confirm. "Show me the notebooks," she said. Ryan looked at her. "All of them," she said. He took a breath. He pulled the notebooks from the shelf, all 11 of them, going back to the beginning. He set them on the workbench in chronological order, which he knew because he'd numbered them. He'd always numbered them. Sophia opened the first one. She didn't rush through it. She stood at his workbench in her good coat in his cold, cluttered garage, and she read. Outside, the October morning continued its business. 2 cars passed on Maple Street. A dog barked somewhere. The country radio played through a song he didn't know. Ryan stood beside the workbench and didn't know what to do with his hands. One of the younger engineers, a woman who had the efficient, slightly intense energy of a recent graduate still operating near full capacity, had taken out a laptop and was pulling up something. "Mr. Walker, do you have your simulation data as well?" The paper referenced computational modeling. I wasn't using professional simulation software. I built the models in a spreadsheet framework and cross-referenced them manually against the physical test results. She stopped typing. A spreadsheet framework. Yeah, I know that's... Can I see it? He opened the laptop that lived permanently at the end of the workbench. An older machine, its case held together with a strip of electrical tape along one hinge, and pulled up the files. The young engineer leaned over and looked at what was on screen. Her expression was difficult to read. "You built this yourself," she said. Not a question. "I had to. I couldn't afford the commercial simulation packages." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "This is actually quite elegant. There are probably more efficient ways to do it." "Probably," she said, "but this works." She looked at him. "This actually works." Sophia had reached the 6th notebook. She'd slowed down on a section near the middle, the pages where the geometric pathway breakthrough had first been worked out. The 11 pages of calculations from the November night Ryan had stayed at the bench until 2 a.m. She was quiet for a long time. Ryan watched her read. He watched the engineer at his laptop. He watched the other 2 engineers going carefully through the data logs from the box. The country radio was playing something slow now. He reached over and turned it off without thinking. The silence was different after that, more focused. "Ryan," Sophia said without looking up from the notebook. "Yeah. Why haven't you patented this?" He was quiet for a second. "Cost." She looked up. "Just cost?" "I looked into it. Patent attorney, filing fees. I got a number somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 to do it right. And that's before any defense costs if someone challenged it." He picked up the shop rag again, turned it over in his hands. $8,000 to $12,000 is... I don't have that. Sophia held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression that wasn't pity. He was sensitive to pity, and had gotten good at identifying it, and this wasn't it. It was something more like the particular focus of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected. "Okay," she said. She set the notebook down. She turned to face him fully. "I want to tell you how we found you." He leaned against the workbench. "I'm listening. My company, Viridian Technologies, I don't know if you're familiar with us.
I've read about you." He had actually. He'd read a profile in an engineering journal about 18 months ago. Sophia Bennett, 30, founder and CEO of Viridian, specializing in advanced thermal management solutions for aerospace and industrial applications. Young company, significant venture backing, reputation for aggressive innovation. He'd read the profile and then, in the way of a man who has learned to manage his own hopes carefully, put it out of his mind. Something in his expression must have indicated as much. Sophia's eyebrows moved slightly. "You know the work." "I know of it. I don't know the specifics of your current projects." "We've been working on a thermal management system for a next-generation propulsion application. I can't give you the details on that yet, but the short version is that we hit a wall. Our engineering team, very good engineers, people with advanced degrees and access to resources you don't have here." She said it directly, without apology or softening, and he respected that. "Couldn't solve a specific efficiency problem at high operational temperatures. We'd been running at it for 8 months. Ryan was very still. 3 months ago, one of my engineers was on a technical forum doing the research she does on her own time, because that's the kind of engineer she is." Sophia glanced at the young engineer with the laptop, who gave a small, slightly embarrassed nod. "She found your paper. She sent it to me with a one-line message that said, 'Read this immediately.'" Sophia paused. "I read it. Then I read it again. Then I sent it to our head of thermal systems, who read it and called me at 8 in the morning and said, and I'm quoting directly, 'Where did this come from and who is this person?'" Ryan looked at the young engineer. She had the decency to look slightly caught out. "You've been reading the forum," he said. "I left some of the replies," she said, "the ones asking about the pathway geometry. I wondered about those." He looked back at Sophia. "You spent 3 months looking for me. We spent 3 months finding you, finding an anonymous username connected to a paper with no institutional affiliation, no name, no contact information." She said it in a tone that suggested this had been an exercise in sustained frustration. "We traced the paper across 3 forums. Your username gave us nothing. Eventually, we had someone do a very careful analysis of writing patterns, terminology, the specific way you described certain technical concepts. It pointed to someone self-taught rather than institutionally trained, someone working in practical rather than theoretical applications, someone based in, we thought, the northeastern United States, based on some passing references." She paused. "And then, Kira, I found a comment you left on a local Cedar Creek community forum about 4 years ago," the young engineer, Kira, said, with the tone of someone confessing to a fairly intensive investigation. "Different username, but the same way of phrasing certain things. The Cedar Creek reference helped us narrow the geography. After that, it was a process." "A process," Ryan repeated. "We really needed to find you," Kira said, with what sounded like genuine feeling. Ryan looked at the 3 black SUVs visible through the open garage door, at the team assembled in his workshop, at Sophia Bennett standing at his workbench with his notebook in her hand. He thought about the night he'd written the paper. Midnight, cold garage, Emma asleep inside, nobody to tell. The impulsive decision to post it. The 2 weeks he hadn't checked the forum. The way he'd almost not written it at all. "Okay," he said. His voice came out a little rough. He cleared his throat. "So you found me." "We found you." Sophia set the notebook down on the stack. "Now I want to understand what you actually have here. Not just the paper. All of it." She looked at the workbench, the shelves, the prototype. "Can you walk me through everything? Start at the beginning." Ryan looked at the prototype. He looked at the notebook stacked on the bench. He looked at the box of data logs. He thought about the 3 weeks he'd been stuck, and the November night when something had clicked, and the 214 thermal cycles, and the roofer named Pete who'd patched the worst of the leak and told him he'd keep having problems. "It started with a broken refrigerator," he said. Sophia almost smiled. "Okay, I'm serious. Pull up a spot. This is going to take a while." She pulled a stool from the corner, the extra one he kept there,
half buried under a jacket and 2 technical manuals, and sat down. Her team settled into positions around the garage. Kira had her laptop open. The other engineer had a fresh notebook out. Ryan picked up the first of his 11 notebooks. The cover was warped from humidity, and the spine had been retaped twice. He set it on the workbench and opened it to the first page. "Okay," he said. "Here's where it started." And he began to talk. He talked for 3 hours. He'd never talked about it like that, but not the full version, not start to finish with someone actually tracking every step. He talked about the first observations, the broken refrigeration unit, the initial thought experiment about sequential versus distributed thermal routing. He talked about the biological research, the dragonfly thermoregulation, the sketch in the margin that he'd almost not bothered with. He talked about the failed prototypes, the coolant leak that had sent him out of the garage coughing, the seal failure on prototype 4 that had soaked the notebooks, the material fatigue issue with prototype 6. He didn't smooth any of it over. He told it the way it had actually happened, including the 3 weeks of being stuck and the night he'd stayed until 2 a.m. and the 11 pages of calculations and not being able to find the mistake. Sophia asked questions throughout, and they were consistently good questions, the kind that demonstrated she was actually following the technical logic rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. Her engineers asked their own questions, which were more specific and often very precise, and Ryan answered all of them. When he didn't know something, when there was a gap in his data or a calculation he hadn't completed or an assumption he'd made that he couldn't fully justify, he said so. He didn't fill the gaps with confidence. He'd spent too long being careful to start bluffing now. At some point, without Ryan noticing when it happened, someone had gotten coffee from somewhere. It turned out one of the SUV drivers had a thermos and had silently provided refills to the engineering team. Ryan discovered this when a cup appeared beside his elbow during a discussion of the microchannel buffer. He drank it without comment and kept going. When he finished, the garage was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The focused, calculating kind of quiet. Sophia looked at her team. Something passed between them, a kind of professional telepathy that comes from working closely with people you trust. "James," she said to the older engineer who'd first looked at the junction modification, "what do you think?" James had the expression of a man running a very rapid internal audit. "The geometry is real," he said. "The underlying principle is sound. The efficiency numbers..." He glanced at Ryan. "Have you had these independently verified?" "No," Ryan said. "I don't. I haven't had the resources for that. Assuming they verify, which based on the data logs I believe they will..." James paused. "We've been trying to solve the high-temperature bottleneck problem for 8 months with a team of 6 engineers and access to simulation tools that cost more than this building. This man solved it in a converted residential garage with salvaged parts and a spreadsheet. He didn't say it with condescension. He said it with something that sounded almost like professional embarrassment, the way an expert sounds when someone outside their field finds something they missed." Sophia turned back to Ryan. "I want to be straight with you about what we're looking for. We're not here to take your work. We're here because we need what you've built. Specifically, we need to know if it scales to industrial applications in the context of our propulsion project. That's going to require testing, resources, and expertise you don't currently have access to." She met his eyes. "I want to talk about a partnership, but I need to understand first whether you're open to that conversation." Ryan was quiet for a moment. The garage felt different than it had at 6:14 that morning. The light was still the same utility yellow, the shelves still sagged the same way, the water stain was still on the ceiling, the coffee was still going cold. "I'm open to the conversation," he said carefully. "Good." Sophia nodded once, the sharp, decisive nod of someone checking a box. "Before we go any further, there are some things I need to be transparent about. All right, this application we're developing, if the thermal system works at scale, it's potentially significant, not just commercially significant. I mean, the kind of thing that gets attention from sectors you might find uncomfortable." Ryan looked at her. "Uncomfortable how?" "Defense applications, government contracts. The propulsion work we're doing has civilian uses, but also potential military ones. I don't know what your feelings are about that." He hadn't expected that. He sat with it for a second. I appreciate you saying that up front. You'd find out anyway. Still, he looked at the prototype. I'd need to understand more about the specific applications before I could tell you where I stand on that. That's fair, and that's a conversation we can have. She paused. I'm also going to tell you that the timeline pressure on our side is real. We have a development window, and if we're going to incorporate this technology into the current project, we don't have a lot of time to run a formal due diligence process at a leisurely pace. How much time? I'd like to bring a formal proposal to you within 2 weeks. Can you give me 2 weeks to put something together that's worth your consideration? Ryan thought about the patent he hadn't been able to afford. He thought about Pete the roofer and the recurring calculation that never came out right. He thought about 8 months and a wall that 6 professional engineers with serious resources couldn't get past. He also thought about the self-doubt that had been sitting in his chest for years, like a stone he'd gotten used to carrying. The voice that said, "You're a mechanic who never finished college. And whatever you think you've built, the people who actually know are going to tell you it's not what you think it is." That voice was still there. It hadn't left. But he looked at James, who had worked in professional engineering teams for what was clearly a long time, saying the geometry is real, the underlying principle is sound. He looked at Kira with her laptop, who had found him through a patient and methodical search because his work had been worth finding. He looked at Sophia, who did not appear to be a person who wasted her time. 2 weeks, he said. Yeah, that works. Sophia stood up from the stool, straightened her coat. One more thing. She looked around the garage with an expression that was direct and professional, but not without something else underneath it. How long have you been working on this? Ryan thought about it. The idea's been developing for 4, maybe 5 years. Serious work, meaning prototypes and test data, about 2.5 years. She absorbed that. Alone. Alone. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. She didn't say anything to it directly. She just nodded once and moved toward the garage door. Her team followed. The practical, efficient process of departure. Portfolios closed, laptops under arms, jackets adjusted. At the doorway, Sophia turned back. Ryan. Yeah. The work is real. She said it like she was reading a fact off a page. No decorative language around it, just the statement. I want you to know that. He didn't say anything for a second. The words landed in a way that required a moment. Okay, he said. She turned and walked to the lead SUV. Her team distributed themselves into the vehicles. The doors closed with that specific solid sound of expensive machinery doing what it was built to do. Ryan stood in the garage doorway and watched the 3 SUVs back out of his driveway. The last one, he noticed, giving a very wide berth to the fence post it had clipped on the way in. They turned onto Maple Street. He watched them go until the last one disappeared around the corner. Across the street, behind the White House with the blue shutters, a curtain was still moving. He stayed in the doorway for a minute, maybe 2. He wasn't counting. The October air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and the approaching winter that Cedar Creek always made you feel coming before it arrived. His breath made small clouds. The utility light behind him still cast its yellow light on the workbench, on the prototype, on the 11 notebooks stacked where he'd left them. He went back inside. He stood at the workbench. He looked at the prototype. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at the temperature gauge reading ambient. He thought about Emma getting off the school bus in 3 hours. She was going to ask how the intake manifold job went. She was going to notice that the 3 SUVs had been in the driveway. The tire tracks were visible in the damp dirt, and she was going to want to know what had happened. She paid attention to everything, she always had. He had no idea what to tell her that didn't sound like either too much or not enough. He picked up the shop rag, looked at it, put it down. He sat down on the stool at the workbench, reached for the cold coffee, and drank it. The work is real. He turned the statement over in his mind the way he turned a poorly fitted part in his hands, checking it from every angle, looking for the flaw, the place where it gave under pressure. Because he'd been wrong about things before. He'd believed in things that didn't pan out. He'd stayed up until 2 a.m. chasing something that turned out to be an arithmetic error. He knew what it felt like to be convinced of something that wasn't true. But James had looked at the junction and said the geometry is real. Kira had looked at the spreadsheet and said this actually works. And Sophia had stood in his garage for 3 hours reading his notebooks with the full and undivided attention of someone who only gave that kind of attention to things that earned it. He reached for the notebook, not to work, not yet, just to hold it, the warped cover, the retaped spine. 11 volumes of nights after Emma went to sleep, of cold coffee and country radio, and the recurring stubborn belief that what he was doing in this garage was worth doing, regardless of whether anyone ever agreed with him. He held the notebook and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and sat with the strange, unsteady feeling of something changing. Outside, the first dead leaves of autumn were moving across the driveway in the wind. Down the street, behind the White House with the blue shutters, the curtain had stopped moving. He had 2 weeks. He set the notebook down. He rolled his shoulders. He reached over and turned the radio back on. The country station, mid-song, something with a fiddle in it. He went back to the 2011 Dodge pickup, picked up his tools, and finished the intake manifold job. Emma had known something was different before Ryan said a single word. She'd gotten off the bus at 3:22 p.m., the way she always did, backpack hanging off one shoulder with the strap at the maximum extension it would go because she'd decided at some point that wearing it properly was not for her. She walked up the driveway and Ryan watched her notice the tire tracks in the damp dirt. 3 sets, wide-spaced, the kind that don't come from pickup trucks or sedans. She looked at the tracks. She looked at the garage. She looked at Ryan standing in the doorway. She didn't say anything until she was close enough to read his face. "What happened?" she asked. "Someone came by today." "Who?" He'd thought about how to answer this on and off for the 3 hours between Sophia leaving and Emma getting home. He'd worked through 2 versions of it. The cautious version, which kept expectations low and protected both of them from a disappointment that might still be coming, and the honest version, which was what he actually felt. He'd decided somewhere around 2 p.m. that the cautious version was a form of lying he didn't want to do. "A CEO from a technology company," he said. "She found the paper I posted." Emma was very still for a second. Then, "The cooling thing paper?" "Yeah." "The one you posted online that one time?" "Yeah." She looked at the tire tracks again. She was putting it together. The 3 sets, the width, the depth of the impression left by vehicles heavier than anything that normally came to this address. "How many people came?" she said. 5, including her. Emma looked at him for a long time with the expression of someone performing a careful internal calibration. He knew this look. She used it when she was deciding how much to let herself feel something before she had more information. "Is it good?" she said. "I think it might be." She nodded once, very deliberately, and went inside to put her backpack down. When she came back to the garage doorway, she'd taken off her jacket and was holding her math homework, which she set on the corner of the workbench with the resigned efficiency of a kid who had accepted that homework existed as a universal condition. She climbed onto the secondary stool, the one Sophia had pulled out earlier, and opened the textbook. "Tell me everything," she said. So he did. He told her about the SUVs and Sophia's direct non-preamble introduction and the 3 hours of walking through the notebooks. He told her about James saying the geometry is real and Kira and the forum post and 7 months of searching. He told her about the 2-week timeline for a proposal. Emma did her math homework while he talked, which was not a sign of inattention. It was, for her, a sign of deep attention. She always processed better when her hands were occupied. He'd figured this out when she was about 6. When he finished, she looked up from the homework. "What's the catch?" "What?" "There's always a catch. What is it?" He paused. She mentioned defense applications, military contracts potentially. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know yet. I need to understand more about what we're actually talking about." Emma considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who had apparently developed opinions about military contracting. "Are you going to sign something?" "Not for 2 weeks. She's bringing a proposal." "You should have someone look at it before you sign anything. A lawyer." Ryan looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "That's a good point. I saw that on a TV show. Always have a lawyer look at contracts." "What show?" "The one about the restaurant that goes out of business. They signed a bad contract and lost everything." "That's a cooking competition show. It had lawyers in it." She looked back at her homework. "I'm just saying, lawyer." He almost laughed. The almost laugh felt good, like something that had been tight loosening slightly. "I'll find a lawyer." "Good." She wrote something in her notebook, erased it, rewrote it. Daddy. Yeah. I'm glad she found you. He didn't say anything for a second. The utility light was doing its yellow thing. Outside, the sky had gone the flat gray of late October afternoon, moving toward evening. Me too, he said. Cedar Creek found out about the visit approximately 14 hours after it happened, which, for Cedar Creek, was practically a delay. By Saturday morning, the day after, Ryan had received 3 text messages from people he hadn't heard from in months, all worded in the specific way of people seeking information while trying to sound casual. Doug Heller from the auto parts store came by in person on Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a belt drive that Ryan had ordered 2 weeks ago and that Doug had not previously found any urgency in delivering. He stood in the garage doorway holding the belt drive and looking at the workbench with an expression that was trying very hard to be natural. Heard you had some visitors yesterday, Doug said. Ryan was replacing a water pump on a Chevy Equinox. He did not look up. Yep. Company people, someone said. Yep. Doug turned the belt drive over in his hands. Big company? Ryan put down the wrench, picked up a different wrench, checked the fitting. Yeah, Doug. It's a real company. Doug set the belt drive on the edge of the bench. He looked at the prototype, which was in its usual position under the utility light. He'd seen it before. Everyone who came into the garage had seen it, and everyone had managed, consistently, to look at it the way you look at a piece of furniture that belongs to a person with eccentric taste. Present, acknowledged, not discussed. He looked at it differently now. Ryan noticed this without acknowledging it. What are they interested in? Doug said. Can't really get into details yet, but it's related to this? He gestured vaguely at the prototype. Yeah. Doug was quiet for a moment. Ryan could feel the social gears turning, the process of revising, of retrofitting new information into an existing framework. He'd seen it on people's faces before, in smaller ways. This was a larger version of it. Huh, Doug said finally. Yep. Well, Doug picked up the belt drive again, seemed to remember he was supposed to leave it, put it back down. That's good, Ryan. That's really good. Thanks, Doug. Doug left. Ryan went back to the water pump. He was aware, in the way that you're aware of a change in air pressure before a storm, that something in the town's social atmosphere had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any formal announcement, just the particular subtle recalibration that happens in a small community when the story it's been telling about one of its members develops a complication. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. He'd spent years learning not to care about Cedar Creek's opinion. The learning had been genuine. It wasn't a performance of not caring that covered actual caring. He'd really arrived at a place where he could go to Patty's diner and run into Dave Kowalski and feel neither resentment nor need. He'd built that equanimity carefully, out of necessity, and he wasn't interested in reversing it now. But the shift was there, and he noticed it, and there was a small and not entirely admirable part of him that noticed it with something that felt uncomfortably like satisfaction. He told that part to be quiet and finished the water pump. The 2 weeks before Sophia's proposal arrived were strange, in a way Ryan hadn't anticipated. He'd expected them to feel long, the patient, low-grade tension of waiting. Instead, they felt alternately too fast and too slow, the way time behaves when something is coming that you're not sure how to prepare for. He worked. He slept inadequately. He drove Emma to school and picked her up and made dinner and helped with homework and did all the ordinary things that constituted the infrastructure of their life together. He also went back to the prototype every evening, refining, testing, running more cycles. He wasn't sure why he kept testing it. The data was already extensive, but sitting at the bench with the temperature gauge in front of him felt like the only reliable orientation point he had, and he needed an orientation point. He also, following Emma's instruction, found a lawyer. Her name was Carol Hewitt, and she operated a small general practice out of an office above the pharmacy on Main Street. She was in her early 50s, practical, and had the specific energy of someone who had been solving other people's problems for a long time and had very few illusions left about how problems worked. When Ryan explained the situation, she listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. "You haven't signed anything?" she said when he finished. "No." "Good. Don't sign anything until I see it." "That's what my daughter told me." Carol looked at him over her reading glasses. "Your daughter sounds sensible." She's 9. Then she's ahead of most adults I deal with. She made notes on a yellow legal pad. Bring me everything. The proposal when it arrives, any email communications, anything they've sent in writing. We'll go through it together before you respond. He left Carol Hewitt's office feeling, for the first time since the SUVs had appeared in his driveway, that he had a plan with actual structure to it. Sophia's proposal arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the visit. Not by courier or formal mail, by email, directly from her, at 6:47 in the morning. The email was 3 paragraphs of direct, undecorated language introducing the attached document, which was 42 pages long, formatted with the dense precision of something that had been worked over by people who got paid a great deal to work things over. Ryan read it once, quickly, to understand the shape of it. Then he printed it. The garage printer ran out of ink on page 31, and he had to go inside to finish on the home printer, and drove it to Carol Hewitt. Carol read it over 2 days. She called him on a Thursday evening. "It's not a bad document," she said. "They're not trying to take everything from you, but there are some things we need to negotiate." "What kind of things?" "The revenue sharing structure is workable, but the percentages favor them more than they should, given that you're the originating inventor. The IP ownership clauses are aggressive, standard for this kind of deal, but worth pushing back on. They want primary patent rights with a licensing arrangement back to you, which is normal but needs better terms. And there's a non-compete provision that's too broad." Ryan was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad of his own. "But it's in good faith? The proposal overall?" Carol was quiet for a moment. "My honest opinion? Yes. These are the things any competent attorney would want to negotiate. They're not trying to bury you in the language. They know what they have, and they know where it came from." She paused. "That said, Ryan, you need to understand the value of what you're bringing to this. Don't let the shock of being discovered lead you to undersell it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes when someone comes to you and says your work is exceptional, the impulse is to be grateful and accommodate. Don't be so grateful that you give away more than is fair." Another pause. "This woman built a company at 30 years old. She's good at negotiation. You need to be good at it too." He sat with that for a second. "Okay. I'll draft a counteroffer. It'll take me 3 or 4 days, then we'll see how they respond." He called Sophia the next morning. She picked up on the second ring, which told him something about how she operated. "I have your proposal," he said. "My attorney is reviewing it." "Good." Her tone was straightforward, no indication of surprise at the attorney. "Anything you want to discuss before the formal response?" "The defense applications question. We talked about it briefly when you were here, and I said I needed more information." "Yes, I'd like that information before we go further." There was a beat on the line. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but he registered it. "That's fair," she said. "Can we set up a call? I'd like to walk you through the specific project. Some of what I'd tell you would be under NDA, which means I'll need you to sign something limited before the call. Just covering the project specifics, not the broader partnership terms." "That I can do without my attorney?" "That one, yes. It's standard confidentiality for project disclosure, not the substantive deal terms." He agreed to a call for the following Monday. He signed the limited NDA. Carol looked at it and cleared it in about 15 minutes. And on Monday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee that he actually remembered to drink while it was hot, he called Sophia's number. The project she described was, he would think about this later, trying to find the right word for it, larger than he'd let himself imagine. Viridian had a development contract for a thermal management system for a new class of hypersonic vehicle. The application was dual use. Civilian research and, yes, potential military procurement. The vehicle's propulsion system generated heat at operational temperatures and cycling frequencies that existing thermal management solutions couldn't sustain without component degradation that made extended operation impractical. Ryan's geometry, according to Sophia's thermal engineers, who had been running models against his data since the day they'd left Cedar Creek, addressed the problem directly, not partially, not as a contributing factor, directly. The models show your pathway geometry maintaining efficiency at temperatures 22% above our current system's failure threshold, Sophia said. Our lead thermal engineer used the word elegant, which he has never, in my experience, used to describe anything. "James?" Ryan said. "James." Ryan was quiet for a moment, staring at the kitchen table. There was a small ring stain from a coffee cup, which he'd been meaning to address for a month. He stared at the ring stain. "What's the timeline on this project?" he said. "We have a development delivery date 14 months out, which means we need to be in advanced testing on the thermal system within 6 months. 6 months to go from my 7th prototype to application testing. We have the resources to move fast. What we don't have, what we couldn't build in 8 months of trying, was the foundational geometry. You built that. We scale it." She paused. "I know this is a lot to take in. I'm taking it in. I want to be direct about something else." Her voice changed, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. "We're not just looking for a licensing deal here, Ryan. I want you involved in the development process, directly involved. Your understanding of this system, the intuitive grasp of what the geometry does and why, is not something we can fully extract from the notebooks. I want you on the project." Ryan stood up from the kitchen table. He wasn't sure why. He just couldn't sit still anymore. He walked to the window. The garage was visible from here, its slightly too small door, the light on inside because he'd left it on this morning when he came in to take the call. "I don't have an engineering degree," he said. "I'm aware. I don't have the professional credentials for—" "Ryan." Her voice was direct without being impatient. "You have 11 notebooks, 214 thermal cycles, and a geometric solution that 6 credentialed engineers couldn't find in 8 months. I understand the credential concern. I also understand what I'm looking at." A pause. "Would you be willing to come to our facility? Meet the team, see the project, understand the scope before you make any decisions?" He looked at the garage, at the door with the slight warp that made it stick in winter, at the light he'd left on. "Where's the facility?" he said. "Outside Boston. We'd cover travel, obviously." He had never been to Boston. He'd been to the state capitol twice for a car parts expo, and once because Emma had a school field trip, and he'd signed up to chaperone, but that was it for his recent geographic range. "I'd need to figure out what to do with Emma." "Bring her." He blinked. "What?" "Bring your daughter. We have a full day planned. I was going to suggest a 2-day visit. There's plenty in the area for a 9-year-old. Kira mentioned she looked like a sharp kid." "How does Kira know what Emma looks like?" A brief silence. "She may have found a school newsletter photo from Cedar Creek Elementary when we were doing the location research. I'm going to be honest, the investigation was quite thorough. Despite everything, despite the weight of the conversation and the hypersonic vehicles and the 14-month timeline, Ryan almost laughed. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to Emma." He didn't have to talk long. Emma's response to, "Would you want to come to Boston to see an engineering facility?" was a look of such unambiguous enthusiasm that it was almost physically bright. "Obviously," she said. "I thought you might want to think about it." "I have thought about it. The answer is obviously." They drove down on a Friday, Ryan in his truck, with Emma in the passenger seat managing the navigation on his phone, with the specific confidence of a child who trusted GPS implicitly and a parent only provisionally when it came to directions. The Viridian facility was 40 minutes outside Boston, in an industrial complex that had been converted into something between a research campus and a working lab. Not the gleaming, Instagram-ready tech campus Ryan had imagined, but something more functional, more honest, with the look of a place where actual work happened. 2-story building, plenty of windows, a loading area visible on one side where equipment moved in and out. The parking lot had regular cars in it alongside several company vehicles. It looked like people worked here. Sophia met them in the lobby. She shook Ryan's hand and then turned to Emma, who looked back at her with the steady, appraising attention she gave everyone she met for the first time. "You must be Emma," Sophia said. "You're the CEO," Emma said. "That's right." "My dad says you're very direct." Sophia looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at a point slightly above Sophia's left shoulder. "He said that as a compliment," Ryan said. "I assumed." Sophia's expression was as close to amused as he'd seen it. She looked back at Emma. "Do you want to see the lab?" "Yes," Emma said. "But also, do you have snacks? We drove a long time and my dad forgot to stop." "I did not forget." "He forgot," Emma said. Sophia smiled, a real one this time, quick and genuine, there and gone. "We have a kitchen, come on." The day was long and, in a way Ryan could only partially process in real time, significant. Sophia walked him through the project with her engineering team, James, Kira, and 4 others Ryan hadn't met. They showed him their existing thermal system, its limitations, the specific failure data from the high-temperature tests. They showed him their simulations run against his geometry. They showed him what they were building and where the gap was, and exactly how his work fit into that gap. Ryan asked questions. He asked a lot of questions. He was aware of a certain self-consciousness in the early part of the day. The awareness of being the least credentialed person in the room, the person without the degree, the person whose professional context was a garage in Cedar Creek. But the self-consciousness had a specific quality. It was external. It sat on the surface of things. Underneath it, when the questions got technical, when they were talking about pathway geometry and thermal cycling and the junction modification and the pressure buffer microchannel, Ryan was entirely at home. This was his language. He'd built it word by word for years. At one point in the afternoon, working through a potential modification to the scale-up geometry on a whiteboard, James disagreed with Ryan's approach. The junction angle at that scale will create turbulence in the secondary pathway, James said. You're assuming laminar flow, but at industrial volumes, I'm not assuming laminar flow. Ryan picked up a marker. The turbulence is actually beneficial at this scale. It disrupts the thermal boundary layer and increases effective heat transfer. Here, he drew the flow diagram on the whiteboard. At smaller scale, the turbulence is a problem because it creates pressure variance. At this scale, the pressure variance is manageable and the transfer benefit outweighs it. James looked at the diagram. He looked at it for a while. Show me the calculation, he said. Ryan wrote it out. James and Kira both looked at it. They discussed it for about 5 minutes between themselves in the specific shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to have their own compression scheme for technical conversation. Then James turned back to Ryan. You're right, he said. It was the tone of a man who'd been in the business long enough to find being wronged by a garage mechanic from Cedar Creek interesting rather than humiliating. I was defaulting to standard scale assumption. It's a reasonable default, Ryan said. The geometry changes the variable. Yes. James wrote something in his own notebook. It does. Sophia had been watching this exchange from across the room. Ryan caught her eye. She gave him the smallest nod. Not performance, just acknowledgement. The kind that passes between people who are both watching the same thing resolve itself. Emma, meanwhile, had been set up with Kira in a side room with access to the same simulation software they'd been using, which Kira had apparently decided was interesting enough to teach a 9-year-old while the adults worked. Ryan checked in at one point and found Emma drawing thermal pathway diagrams with Kira's guidance, asking questions with the focused intensity she brought to anything that held her attention. She's extremely sharp, Kira told Ryan, not quietly enough, as if Emma wasn't sitting right there. I know, Emma said, without looking up from the diagram. At the end of the day, Sophia walked Ryan to a small conference room while Emma waited in the kitchen, apparently having struck up a conversation with one of the lab technicians about a 3D printer she'd spotted. Sophia closed the door. She sat across from him at the small table. Well, she said. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He'd been turning things over all day. The scale of the project, the team, the facility, the gap his work filled. The way James had said, you're right, without any drama around it. The way the models on the screens had matched in their complex animated flows, something he'd worked out on paper at a kitchen table at midnight. The non-compete in your proposal is too broad, he said. Sophia's expression shifted slightly. The shift of someone who'd prepared for this conversation and was now actually in it. How broad are you willing to accept? 2 years, thermal management applications only. No adjacent technology restriction. 3 years and we include adjacent thermal applications. 2.5, thermal only. She considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Agreed. What else? The IP ownership structure. Primary patent filing should be joint, not licensed back to me. Joint from the start. That's a significant ask. I built it alone for 2.5 years, Ryan said. His voice was even, not aggressive, not apologetic, just even. Joint. Sophia looked at him for a moment. This was, he understood, the actual negotiation. Not the terms on paper, but the one happening in this room between two people deciding what this was. Joint filing, she said. But Viridian holds primary commercialization rights with revenue share. 30% to me, escalating to 35 at commercial deployment. 25 escalating to 30. 28, flat. She was quiet for 2 seconds. 28, with a performance clause that bumps to 32 if the system meets the project's primary specifications on the delivery timeline. Ryan thought about this. It was a good structure. It tied his upside to a successful outcome, which he was willing to bet on. All right, he said. The involvement piece, Sophia said. I want you on the development team, formally, paid position. We'll agree on terms. I need you available for the next 6 months at minimum. I have a garage. I have a daughter. I'm not relocating. Remote, with agreed on-site visit frequency. We'll figure out the logistics. She paused. Ryan, I want this to be an actual partnership, not you signing away something and watching from a distance. He looked at her. He thought about Carol Hewitt saying, don't be so grateful that you give away more than is fair. He thought about Emma saying obviously before he'd even finished the question. He thought about the workbench and the cold coffee and the 11 notebooks and the temperature gauge reading ambient. Okay, he said. They shook hands across the small table in the small conference room. Outside the window, the last of the October light was going. It was not a perfect agreement. The actual contract would take 3 more weeks and 2 rounds of Carol Hewitt's red ink. There would be a moment halfway through the second round when Ryan would spend an entire evening convinced that the deal was going to fall apart over a single clause in the IP section and would sit at the workbench not working, just sitting, until Emma came out at 10 o'clock to find him and sit beside him without speaking for 20 minutes, which was the specific kind of help he needed. There would be a morning when Sophia called about the patent timeline, and her voice had an edge that indicated she was dealing with pressures on her side that she wasn't fully sharing. There would be paperwork and legal language, and the specific existential flatness of having something important reduced to numbered paragraphs. But the handshake across the small table was real, and Ryan Walker, who had worked alone in a cold garage for 2.5 years, and before that had studied alone in a quiet house for years more, and before that had stood in front of a wall that was once a door, drove home from Boston that night with his daughter asleep in the passenger seat and the highway unrolling in front of him, and something in his chest that he couldn't have explained if anyone had asked. He drove. Emma slept. The highway markers went by one at a time. He turned the radio on low, not country, something else, something he didn't recognize, and drove the rest of the way home through the dark. The contract was signed on a Wednesday morning in Carol Hewitt's office above the pharmacy, which smelled of old paper and the particular brand of hand lotion Carol kept on her desk, and which Ryan had come to associate over the previous 3 weeks with the smell of sustained legal attention. Carol had negotiated hard. Ryan had watched her do it. The phone calls with Viridian's legal team, the precise, unhurried way she worked through the language, the moments when she'd go quiet on a call and let the silence sit until the other side filled it. She'd gotten the IP structure Ryan had asked for, the 28% with the performance escalator, and a non-compete narrow enough to be livable. She'd also quietly inserted a clause that gave Ryan approval rights on any public attribution of the technology, meaning no press release, no patent filing, no conference paper could describe the work without his sign-off on how his name appeared. You might not think that matters now, Carol had said when she walked him through it. It will matter later. He'd signed where she indicated. 3 copies. His handwriting looked unfamiliar to him on the signature lines, the way your own voice sounds wrong in a recording. When it was done, Carol took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk and looked at him with the expression of someone who has successfully navigated something complicated and is allowing herself 30 seconds to acknowledge it before moving on. Anything you want to ask? She said. Is it good? It's fair, which, in my experience, is better than good. She capped her pen. You protected yourself without being unreasonable. That's the right outcome. He drove home from Carol's office and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The garage door was closed, which was unusual for a weekday morning. He'd closed it deliberately the night before, some instinct about wanting the day to start clean, without the prototype visible first thing. He wasn't sure that logic made sense, but he'd done it anyway. He went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at nothing in particular for about 10 minutes. Then he called Sophia to confirm the signing. Good, she said, and he could hear the specific quality of relief in that single word. The relief of someone who has been managing a complex timeline and just had one significant variable resolve. Kira will reach out today to set up the first working sessions. We want to move fast on the scale-up geometry. How fast? She'll explain the schedule. It's ambitious. Define ambitious. You'll see. A pause. Ryan, how are you feeling? It was not the kind of question he'd expected from her. She was direct, she was professional, she ran her conversations with the efficiency of someone for whom time was genuinely scarce. How are you feeling was a different register. He thought about it honestly. Like I signed something real, he said, which is different from how I thought I'd feel. Different how? I thought it would feel like relief, maybe, or excitement. He looked at the kitchen table, at the coffee ring stain he still hadn't addressed. It feels like the weight changed direction. Not lighter, just different weight. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Yeah, she said, that's accurate. He didn't ask her what she meant by that. He thought he understood it. Kira's schedule arrived by email at 4 that afternoon and was, as Sophia had indicated, ambitious. Working sessions 3 times a week, remote, 2 hours each. Site visits every 3 weeks. A 6-month timeline to move from Ryan's 7th prototype geometry to a tested, validated scale-up version ready for integration into Viridian's propulsion project. All of this while Ryan maintained his garage, handled existing customers, and remained the primary caregiver for Emma. He printed the schedule, looked at it, and then went to the garage and stood at the workbench for a while without doing anything in particular. The prototype sat under the utility light. The notebooks were on the shelf. The data logs were in the box. Everything was exactly as it had been for years, unchanged by the signed papers, unchanged by the 3 SUVs in the driveway, unchanged by any of it. He picked up the 7th notebook and opened it to the junction modification diagrams. He'd looked at these pages hundreds of times. He looked at them again now. Then he turned to a fresh page and started working on the scale-up problem. The first month was harder than he'd expected, though not in the ways he'd expected. The technical work was intense but manageable, more than manageable. The remote sessions with Kira and James had a rhythm that developed quickly, the kind of functional shorthand that comes when everyone in a room cares about the same problem and speaks the same language. They'd work through a section of the scale-up geometry on a shared digital whiteboard, Ryan annotating from the garage on his old laptop with the electrical tape hinge, Kira running real-time simulations, James asking the specific questions that exposed the places where Ryan's intuition needed to be made explicit. Ryan was wrong about things, regularly, and the first time it happened, he'd felt the old self-consciousness rising up. The self-taught mechanic wrong in front of the credentialed engineers. But James just marked the correction without drama. Kira updated the model, and the conversation continued. Being wrong was, in their professional culture, a technical event rather than a social one. Ryan adjusted to this faster than he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the fatigue. Not physical fatigue, though there was that too. The late nights, the early mornings, the sustained concentration of working 2 full jobs simultaneously. The harder thing was the cognitive exhaustion of operating in 2 completely different registers at once. By day he was the garage. Oil changes, tire rotations, brake jobs, the routine physical work of keeping old cars running, the conversations with customers who were sometimes pleasant and sometimes not, the persistent background noise of Cedar Creek being Cedar Creek. By evening, he was the scale-up geometry, the thermal simulations, the expanding technical vocabulary of a project that was larger and more complex than anything he'd ever worked on. The boundary between these 2 registers was his dinner table, which meant it was also Emma's dinner table, and Emma noticed things. "You're doing the face," she said one evening in late November. She was eating macaroni and cheese, which she had strong opinions about making from scratch, and which Ryan had strong opinions about not making from scratch when the box version existed and they were both tired. "What face?" "The one where you're not actually here." He set down his fork. "I'm here." "You answered my question about the school project with, yeah, the microchannel buffer, which is not a school project." He had not been aware of saying that out loud. "Sorry, tell me about the school project." "It's a model of the solar system. We have to make the planets out of different sized balls." She poked her macaroni. I was going to ask if you had any spherical things in the garage I could use. Definitely. What size do you need for...
I already figured it out. I found some bearings in the third shelf bin.
I wanted to tell you, but you weren't listening. He looked at her. She looked back, the expression not quite hurt. Emma processed most things through a practical lens rather than an emotional one, but containing something that required acknowledgement. I'm sorry, he said. Not the reflexive kind of sorry, the actual kind. She looked at him for a moment, calibrating. Are you going to be like this for the whole 6 months? I'm going to try not to be. That's not a no. No, he said. I'm going to be better at the dinner table. That's a yes. She considered this. Okay. She went back to her macaroni. The bearings I found, I think they're from an alternator. Probably. That work for the planets? Jupiter's going to be a tennis ball. I couldn't find anything big enough in the garage. We've got a tennis ball somewhere. I know, I already found it. She looked up. Daddy, is this what you thought it was going to be? The Viridian thing? He thought about it honestly, the way he'd learned to think about things with Emma, without the protective coating of reassurance. Not exactly, he said. It's bigger than I thought, which is good, but it's also harder than I thought, which is just true. Hard like it's not working? No. Hard like it takes a lot. He paused. The work is real. I keep checking it, and it keeps being real. Emma nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away. Okay, she said. I just needed to know if it was the good kind of hard or the bad kind. Good kind. Good. She ate her macaroni. Tell me about the microchannel buffer thing you were thinking about. He almost told her she didn't need to know about that, but she was looking at him with the specific, interested attention of a kid who had grown up in a garage and genuinely wanted to understand the thing that was taking up so much of her father's head. So he told her. He kept it simple. Translation rather than explanation, but he told her. She listened the whole way through, asked one question. So the buffer is like a pressure shock absorber? Which was, in its way, exactly right. He told her so. She looked pleased in the contained way she expressed pleasure, and they finished dinner. Later, after she was in bed, he sat at the workbench and thought about what she'd said. The good kind of hard or the bad kind. It was, he realized, a meaningful distinction, and he hadn't been making it clearly enough in his own internal accounting. He'd been carrying the difficulty as a single undifferentiated weight, when most of it, the technical challenges, the schedule pressure, the intensity of operating at a level he'd spent years preparing for without knowing exactly what he was preparing for, was good hard. The kind that meant something was actually happening. He opened the 12th notebook, the first one that wasn't part of the original project, the one he'd started the week after signing the contract, and got back to work. Cedar Creek, meanwhile, was having its own adjustment. The story of Ryan Walker and the 3 black SUVs had moved through the town's social system with the speed and thoroughness that only small towns achieve, acquiring details and modifications along the way in the manner of all town narratives. By December, the version circulating at Patty's Diner had the SUVs belonging to a government agency, which was inaccurate but more dramatic. Doug Heller had apparently told someone at the hardware store that he'd always suspected Ryan was onto something, which Ryan heard about secondhand and which caused him to experience an emotion that he chose not to examine too closely. The practical effect on the garage was an increase in business. Not dramatic. Cedar Creek wasn't large enough for dramatic, but real. Cars that had previously been going to the next town's shop started coming back. A few new customers appeared who seemed, based on their slightly excessive conversational interest in Ryan's professional life, to be motivated more by curiosity than by automotive need. Ryan serviced their cars without comment and did not encourage the curiosity. Dave Kowalski came in with his truck in early December, something he hadn't done in at least 2 years. He was friendly in the specific way of a man who has recognized that he'd been wrong about something and is attempting to compensate without explicitly acknowledging it. Ryan replaced his brake pads and charged him the standard rate. "So you're working with that company now," Dave said, in the conversational tone of someone who already knows the answer. "Yeah. Aerospace stuff," someone said. "Can't really talk about the project details." Dave nodded in the way people nod when they've received the response they expected, and it confirmed something. Well, he said, that's something, Ryan. Thanks, Dave. There was a pause. Dave was clearly working towards something, some additional statement that was supposed to close a loop he felt was open between them. Ryan watched him work toward it without helping. I might have underestimated what you were doing out here, Dave said finally. It came out roughly, without the smooth finish of something he'd rehearsed, which made it more real. Ryan looked at him for a second. He thought about Patty's diner, the corner booth, the school board women, and the pause that finished sentences without words. He thought about hobbies. He thought about all the years of careful, quiet construction of an interior life that Cedar Creek hadn't been able to see and hadn't tried very hard to. Thanks for saying that, Ryan said. He meant it. Not fully, not without residue. There was still a layer of something underneath the graciousness, a layer he might always have. But he meant it enough. Dave left. Ryan swept the garage and thought about the specific texture of being acknowledged by someone who'd dismissed you. It was not as satisfying as he might have once imagined. It was mostly just complicated. The harder piece came in February. Ryan had been on the Viridian project for 3 months. The scale-up geometry was in advanced development. They'd moved through several iterations, each one tested against Kira's simulations and checked against the physical principles Ryan kept anchored in his notebooks. James had become in the way of a professional relationship built on mutual technical respect, something approaching a colleague. They disagreed regularly and productively. Kira had taken to sending Ryan research papers at hours that indicated she had no established bedtime, and he'd taken to reading them. The problem came on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a phone call from Sophia. He was under a Subaru when the phone rang. He came out, saw it was her, and felt something shift in his chest before he answered. Some instinctive reading of the timing that told him this wasn't a routine update call. "We have a complication," she said. He sat on the rolling stool. "Tell me." "There's a competing patent application." Her voice was controlled, the way it got when she was managing something serious without letting the management become the story. Filed 6 weeks ago by a research group at a university in Germany, the application covers a distributed multi-pathway thermal geometry. It's not identical to your work. Their approach is meaningfully different. But there's enough overlap in the claimed principles that our patent attorney is concerned about a conflict. Ryan was very still. "How concerned?" he said. "Enough to recommend we accelerate the patent filing timeline significantly, which means I need you to be available for an intensive documentation session this week, going through your notebooks, establishing the development timeline, proving the priority date." "The notebooks are dated," he said. "Every entry." "I know, that's our best asset here, but we need it formalized. I'm going to send a patent attorney to Cedar Creek. Can you do Thursday?" "Yeah." "Ryan." A pause. "This is the kind of thing that happens with significant innovations. I don't want you to panic." "I'm not panicking." "I know. I'm telling you not to anyway." He went back inside and sat at the workbench for a while. Not working, just sitting with it. The patent filing was something he hadn't been able to afford before Viridian, hadn't been able to protect himself with. And now that the protection was finally possible, there was a competing claim appearing from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He thought about the November night, the 11 pages, the 214 thermal cycles. He thought about the fact that the first notebook was dated 4 years ago, that the dragonfly margin sketch was in a notebook he could date to a specific week, that every calculation, every failed prototype, every correction had been recorded and numbered. He thought about how compulsive he'd been about the notebooks, the numbering, the dating, not because he'd been anticipating a patent dispute, but because that was just how his mind worked. He'd always written things down. His father had called it the engineer in him, back when there was still reason to use that description without qualification. The patent attorney arrived on Thursday. Her name was Margaret Okafor, and she was from Viridian's legal firm. Mid-40s, efficient, with the particular manner of someone accustomed to working quickly in unfamiliar environments. She sat at the workbench for 4 hours going through the 11 numbered notebooks, cross-referencing dates, photographing pages, building what she called a priority timeline. At one point, she stopped on the page with the dragonfly margin sketch. "This is the biological inspiration reference?" she said. "Yeah." "What's the date on this notebook?" March, 3 years ago. The entry's on the 7th. I date them at the top when I start a session. She photographed the page from multiple angles. And the German application, the date on their earliest referenced research is 18 months ago. Ryan looked at her. So my work predates theirs by a significant margin if the notebooks hold up, which based on what I'm seeing, they will. She was still looking at the dragonfly sketch. You drew this from observation? From a research paper. I found the image in an entomology journal. He paused. I have the journal. I kept it. Do you have the specific issue? He went to the shelf along the back wall. Third shelf, left section, behind 2 technical manuals and a clutch assembly he'd been meaning to return to storage. He found the journal. The relevant pages were marked with a strip of paper torn from a notebook margin. He handed it to her. Margaret Okafor looked at the marked pages. She looked at the margin sketch in the notebook. She looked up at Ryan. Mr. Walker, she said, and her tone had shifted slightly from the efficient procedural register she'd been using. How much of this, all of this, she gestured at the shelves, the notebooks, the boxes. How much of it is documented this way? All of it, he said. Every session, every test, every result. I've always written everything down. She looked at the shelves for a moment. Why? It was a genuine question, not adversarial, just curious. He thought about it. Because I was working alone, he said. I had nobody to report to. The notebooks were the record. If something worked, I needed to know exactly what I'd done so I could do it again. If something failed, I needed to know why. The dates were just... He paused. I don't know. Habit, I guess. My father was like that. Margaret Okafor made a note. Then she said very carefully, the priority claim is strong. I want to be clear that nothing is guaranteed. Patent disputes are their own ecosystem, and outcomes aren't predictable. But the documentation here is exceptional. It tells a complete story with dates, and the story predates the competing application by a substantial margin. He let out a breath he hadn't fully known he was holding. Will it be enough? He said. I believe so. I'm going to be honest. I've done a lot of prior art research. I've gone through a lot of inventor documentation. Most of it is incomplete, undated, inconsistent. She looked at the shelf of numbered notebooks. This is not that. After she left, Ryan stood in the garage for a long time. The close call quality of it, the way something he'd done reflexively, habitually, without strategic intention, had turned out to be the thing that protected him, sat with him in a particular way. He called Sophia that evening. Margaret said the documentation is strong, Sophia said when he reported the session. She told me. She also told me not to be certain. She's right, but I've worked with Margaret for 3 years. When she says, I believe so, she means it. A pause. How are you doing? I keep thinking about the notebooks, he said. If I'd been less obsessive about dating them, you weren't, though. Right, but if... Ryan, her voice was direct but not without something softer underneath it. You can run that scenario as long as you want, or you can spend the energy on the scale-up geometry review I sent you yesterday. He almost smiled. That's not a very sympathetic response. I'm not a very sympathetic person. A beat. But for what it's worth, what you built in that garage, the way you documented it, the fact that you took it seriously enough to treat it like professional work when you had no professional context for it, that's why we're in a strong position right now. That's not luck. He didn't say anything for a moment. Okay, he said. Send me the geometry review. She sent it. He worked on it until midnight. The patent dispute resolved 3 months later in Viridian's favor, or rather, in Ryan's favor, since his name was on the filing, with Margaret Okafor establishing prior art clearly enough that the German group's application was required to narrow its claims to the specific elements that didn't overlap with Ryan's work. Ryan heard about the resolution by email. He was in the garage at the time, running a thermal cycle test on the latest scale-up prototype that James had shipped to him for physical evaluation alongside the simulation work. The email came in on his phone, one line from Margaret. Priority confirmed. Filing proceeds as submitted. He set the phone down. He checked the temperature gauge. He wrote the reading in the 12th notebook. Then, in the margin next to the reading, he wrote the date, the way he always did. Spring came to Cedar Creek with the particular abruptness of northeastern springs. 2 weeks of mud and gray, then suddenly one morning everything was green and the light had changed and you couldn't remember exactly when it had happened. Ryan noticed it the morning he walked out to the garage and didn't need his jacket. The scale-up prototype was 3 iterations further along than the one James had shipped in February. Ryan had made a modification to the secondary pathway geometry in March, a refinement that addressed a minor but persistent efficiency variance at a specific temperature threshold, and the modification had improved the overall performance numbers by nearly 4%. He'd sent the data to James at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night with a subject line that said, "Third pathway fix. Look at this." James had responded at 7 a.m., Monday, with 2 words, "running simulations." By 10 o'clock, he'd confirmed the improvement. They were on track. The delivery timeline was holding. Ryan was standing at the bench on a Tuesday morning in April, reviewing the simulation results from the latest Viridian run, when Emma appeared in the garage doorway. She had her backpack on, the strap at its full extension. She was watching him in the particular way she watched him when she had something to say, and was choosing her timing. "You look different," she said. He looked up from the laptop. Different how? She thought about it seriously. Emma never answered that kind of question carelessly. "Like you're in the right place," she said. "You used to look like you were in the right place and the wrong place at the same time." He looked at her. She stood in the doorway in the April morning light, too big backpack, the flannel jacket she'd outgrown but refused to stop wearing because she'd decided it was hers now. "Go catch your bus," he said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Bus." She went. He listened to her footsteps on the driveway, the sounds of the school bus arriving a few minutes later, the particular diesel grumble of its departure. The garage was quiet. The laptop screen showed the simulation results. The 12th notebook was open to a page dense with calculations. He sat down. He thought about what she'd said. Like, "You're in the right place." He wasn't sure that was precisely accurate, or rather, it was accurate but incomplete. He was in a right place. He was also in a very demanding, sometimes frightening, consistently exhausting place where the stakes were higher than anything he'd operated at before and the margin for error was narrower and the distance between where he was and where the project needed to go was still real and would require real work to cross. But the self-doubt, the stone he'd gotten used to carrying, the voice that said you're a mechanic who never finished college, had changed, not disappeared. It still spoke. But its authority had been eroded by specific, verifiable, documented evidence, and Ryan Walker had always been a man who paid attention to evidence. He reached for the notebook. He found his place in the calculation. He kept going. The last week of April brought an email from Sophia with a subject line he hadn't expected. Symposium. "Are you available?" The body of the email explained that Viridian had been invited to present preliminary findings from the propulsion project's thermal management development at an engineering symposium in 3 weeks. The work was at a stage where selected elements could be disclosed without compromising the project's competitive position. Sophia wanted Ryan to co-present. He read the email 3 times, then he called her. "I'm not a presenter," he said when she picked up. "You're about to be." "Sophia, I've never given a professional presentation. I've never been to a professional symposium. I'm a mechanic from Cedar Creek who has been on this project for 6 months. You're the originating inventor of the technology being presented." Her voice was patient but certain. "James will be there. Kira will be there. But the pathway geometry, the conceptual foundation, that's yours. It should be presented by you. There will be engineers there, credentialed engineers. Yes, some of them will be very smart. Some of them will be looking for the mistake because they don't like being surprised by someone outside the institutional system." She paused. "You've already answered every serious question James and Kira could ask. You've defended the work against a patent challenge. You know this material better than anyone in that room will." He was quiet. "Ryan." Her voice shifted just slightly. "You've been doing the work without the recognition for years. I'm asking you to stand up and take the recognition. I know it's harder than it sounds, but it's the right move." He stood at the workbench. He looked at the prototype, the notebooks, the temperature gauge reading ambient in the April light. He thought about career day. Emma at the kitchen table asking if he was going to talk about the cooling thing. The careful, protective silence he'd maintained for years. The not talking about it to people who'd laugh. The not entering the world where it could be evaluated. The not risking the thing that was most real to him. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. Kira will help you build the presentation. She's very good at it. He exhaled. Okay. Yeah? Yeah, okay. After he hung up, he stood in the garage for a while. The April morning was warming up outside. He could hear the neighborhood coming alive, cars in driveways, someone's lawnmower starting up 2 streets over. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday in Cedar Creek. He pulled a fresh page in the notebook and wrote at the top, Symposium Preparation, Key Concepts. Then he started writing. Kira had been right that she was good at building presentations. She was also, Ryan discovered, over 3 weeks of preparation calls, almost pathologically thorough. She sent him slide drafts at hours that confirmed she genuinely did not sleep on any consistent schedule, followed by revision notes, followed by simulation graphics rendered in 3 different formats in case one of them displayed poorly on the symposium's projection system, which she had apparently researched in advance by contacting the venue directly. You called the conference center about their projector? Ryan said, on their 4th preparation call. I called about the display resolution and the room dimensions. I wanted to know how large your diagrams would render from the back row. A pause. The room holds 240 people. The back row is 63 feet from the screen. Kira. The pathway geometry diagrams have fine detail that matters. I wanted to make sure people could see it. He didn't argue with this. It was, in its particular way, exactly right. He'd spent years working on details that nobody had seen. He wasn't going to let them be invisible now because of a resolution issue. The preparation itself was harder than he'd expected, though differently hard than the technical work. The technical work required precision and attention and the willingness to be wrong and correct and wrong again. Presenting required something he'd never formally developed. The ability to translate the interior logic of his own thinking into language that moved clearly and quickly through a room full of strangers who had their own frameworks and their own skepticisms, and no particular investment in understanding him. He practiced in the garage. He stood at the workbench and talked to the wall and the prototype and the notebooks and felt, consistently, that he sounded either too technical or not technical enough, either too careful or not careful enough. He recorded himself on his phone once, listened to 30 seconds of it, and deleted it with the conviction of a man who had heard something he did not need to hear again. Emma watched one practice session from the stool in the corner. You're doing the thing, she said when he finished a section on the geometric pathway concept. What thing? The thing where you talk like you're apologizing for what you're saying. He stopped. I'm not. You keep saying what I mean is, and I should clarify, and this might be obvious, but you don't do that when you're actually explaining something to me. You just explain it. She had her knees pulled up to her chest on the stool, the flannel jacket that was technically too small. Talk like you know what you're talking about. Because you do. He looked at her for a long moment. When did you get this way? He said. What way? Like this. She considered the question genuinely. I think I've always been like this. You just notice it more now. She unfolded herself from the stool. Do it again. From the pathway section, and stop apologizing. He did it again. She watched. When he finished, she gave him a single nod, the Emma Walker variant of a standing ovation, and went inside to finish her homework. He stood in the garage afterward, feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks of preparation, like he might actually be ready. The symposium was held in Boston, 40 minutes from Viridian's facility, in a conference center attached to a hotel that was considerably nicer than anything Ryan had occasion to be in on a regular basis. He drove up the day before with Emma, who had negotiated her attendance on the grounds that it was an educational experience and that her teacher had agreed with apparent sincerity that this counted as a field trip. Your teacher said that? Ryan said. Mrs. Patterson said, and I am quoting, Emma, that is not a normal thing that happens to people's dads, and you should absolutely go. Kira had booked them into the conference hotel, which Emma evaluated with the systematic attention of someone conducting an inspection. She noted the quality of the bathroom fixtures, the thread count of the sheets by feel, and the fact that the television was larger than the one at home. She communicated all of this with the expression of someone maintaining professional neutrality in the face of strong opinions. "This is nice," she said, finally. "Don't get used to it." "I'm not getting used to it. I'm just noting that it's nice." She set her backpack on the bed. "What time is the thing tomorrow?" "Registration at 8. I present at 10:30. "Are you nervous?" He'd been asking himself that question for 3 weeks without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. What he felt wasn't exactly the stage fright variety of nervous, the hollow stomach, the dread of performance. It was something with more weight to it. The particular exposure of bringing something private into a public space. He'd kept the work protected for years, not out of strategy, but out of survival. Now he was being asked to stand in front of 240 people and say, "This is what I built, and I believe it is real, and here's why." "Yeah," he said. "A little." Emma nodded. "Good," she said. "You should be a little nervous. It's a real thing." He wasn't sure if that was comforting or not. It was accurate, though. Sophia found him into the conference center lobby at 7:45 the next morning, 30 seconds after he walked in. She had the settled, slightly compressed energy of someone who'd already been running for hours. Coffee in hand, the tablet under her arm. She was wearing a different version of the dark professional clothes from Cedar Creek, which Ryan had come to understand was simply how she dressed, as consistent as a uniform. She looked at him. He was wearing the better of his 2 dress shirts, which Emma had ironed that morning with a concentration that suggested she'd looked up how to iron things specifically for this occasion. "Ready?" Sophia said. "Ask me at 10:29, he said. She almost smiled. "James and Kira are already set up. The AV is working. The pathway geometry renders well on the main screen, Ryan. I checked." She paused. "Kira called the venue about the projector." "I know. Of course she did." Sophia looked at him for a moment with the direct assessment she gave things she was serious about. "Ryan, you know this work better than anyone in that room. Hold on to that." He held on to it. The first part of the morning was other people presenting. Ryan sat in the second row with James on one side and Kira on the other and watched 2 presentations that were technically competent and one that was genuinely interesting. A materials researcher from a university in Ohio presenting work on high-temperature alloy behavior that had real implications for propulsion applications. Ryan made a note in the margin of his program. He couldn't help it. Some habits were just structural. At 10:15, he went backstage, which was really a side corridor with a coffee station and a folding table covered in name badges, and stood with his notes and the particular interior stillness that comes just before something you can't undo. James appeared beside him. He had a coffee and the expression of a man who had done this many times and found it neither dramatic nor trivial. "Don't try to cover everything," James said. "Cover the core principle, the geometry, the efficiency data. Leave room for questions. The questions are where you'll land it." "What do you mean?" "When they ask you questions, the real questions, the ones from people who've actually followed the technical argument, right? That's where they'll decide whether you know what you're talking about. And you do." He looked at Ryan with the specific frankness of a man for whom professional respect was a limited resource not given out casually. "You know this work in a way I don't. I know the engineering mechanics. You know why it works. That difference matters in a room like this." Ryan looked at him. "That might be the nicest thing you've said to me." "Don't make it weird," James said, and went back to his coffee. He walked out to the podium at 10:31, 1 minute late because the previous session had run over, to a room that was nearly full. 200 and some people with laptops and notebooks, and the professionally skeptical attention of experts who had heard a lot of presentations and had reasonable defenses against being impressed. He set his notes on the podium. He looked up at the room. In the 4th row, Emma was sitting next to Sophia. Emma had her own notebook open. She'd brought it specifically, and her pencil was ready. Sophia was watching him with the focused attention she gave things she cared about. Emma caught his eye and gave him the single, deliberate nod. The Emma Walker standing ovation delivered in advance. He stopped apologizing. "The problem with how we currently move heat through high-performance systems," he said, his voice coming out steadier than he'd expected, "is that we've spent 50 years getting very good at solving the wrong version of the problem." The room was quiet. He had their attention. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. He kept going. He talked for 22 minutes. He talked about sequential versus distributed thermal routing, about the geometry of the pathway, about the biological observation that had reoriented his thinking. He talked about the efficiency data, 22% above the existing failure threshold, without hedging the numbers or apologizing for them. He showed the diagrams, and in the back row, 63 feet from the screen, the fine detail was visible because Kira had made it so. He talked about the scale-up work and what the integration with Viridian's propulsion project had required and what it had produced. He did not mention Cedar Creek. He did not mention the leaking roof or the cold coffee or the customers who'd stopped coming. Those things were real, and they were his, but they were not the point. The point was on the diagrams, and in the data and in the geometry of a system that moved heat the way living things had always moved it, and nobody in that room needed the backstory to understand the work. When he finished, the room was quiet for a beat. Then the questions started. There were 12 of them before the session moderator called time, and James had been right. The questions were where it landed. The first 3 were straightforward, the kind that tests whether you understand your own data. Ryan answered them. The 4th was sharper, from a man in the 6th row with the bearing of someone who'd spent his career in thermal engineering and had the accumulated confidence of that career behind his skepticism. The turbulence claim at industrial scale, the man said. You're arguing beneficial turbulence in the secondary pathway. That goes against standard laminar flow optimization doctrine. Standard doctrine assumes a single sequential pathway, Ryan said. In a distributed geometry, the turbulence in the secondary pathway disrupts the thermal boundary layer at the junction points. The heat transfer benefit outweighs the pressure cost because you're not running a single critical path. You have redundancy. The system absorbs the turbulence effect rather than accumulating it. He paused. I have 214 thermal cycles of physical test data supporting the claim, along with simulation verification. I'm happy to share the dataset. A small silence. The man in the 6th row made a note. I'd like to see that dataset, he said. His tone had changed, not dramatically. He wasn't the kind of person who changed tone dramatically, but it had changed. Ryan said he'd make sure it was available. 2 more questions. Then a woman near the back, he couldn't see her clearly from the podium, asked the one he hadn't expected. Can you talk about your research background? The institutional affiliation on the filing is Viridian, but the originating work predates the partnership. Where did this come from? The room shifted slightly. He felt it. The specific attention that comes when a room senses that a question has touched something real. He looked at the woman. He looked at Emma in the 4th row, who had her pencil poised above her notebook and was watching him with full attention. He thought about what to say. He could give the compressed professional version, independent research, several years of development. He could give the version that described the work without the context. Both would be accurate. Both would be, in their way, incomplete. I'm a mechanic, he said. I run a garage in a small town in upstate New York. I've been doing independent engineering research for about 5 years, self-taught, no institutional affiliation, working from salvaged materials and my own notebooks. He kept his voice even. Not defiant, not apologetic, just the fact of it. The work started with an observation about thermal management in biological systems and turned into a 7 prototype development process that I documented in 11 notebooks before Viridian found the paper I posted on an engineering forum. He paused. I didn't finish college. I didn't have access to professional equipment or simulation software. What I had was the problem, a workbench, and enough time to keep working on it until something real came out the other side. The room was quiet. He'd thought, preparing for this moment, and he had prepared for it because the question of his background was always going to come up, that the silence would be the uncomfortable kind, the kind that means we don't know what to do with this information. It wasn't that kind. The man in the 6th row was the first to respond. He'd spent 40 years in thermal engineering. He had the accumulated confidence of that career and the accumulated skepticism, and what Ryan saw on his face now was neither of those things. Well, the man said. He didn't say anything after that. He just nodded, slowly, once, the way people nod when something has been adequately explained. The applause started in the back of the room and moved forward. It wasn't the prolonged standing ovation kind. This was a technical conference, not a ceremony, and the people in it expressed approval in the measured way of professionals. But it was real. and it lasted, and Ryan stood at the podium and felt it and didn't look away from it. In the fourth row, Emma had stopped writing in her notebook. She was just watching him, her pencil resting against the page. Her expression was the contained, deliberate version of something that was larger underneath. Sophia was watching him too. He caught her eye. She gave him the single nod. His nod, the one he'd given her when she said the work is real, reflected back. He gathered his notes. He stepped back from the podium. He had done it. The afternoon was a different kind of demanding. A series of conversations that began during the coffee break after his session and continued, with variations, through the lunch that followed. People he hadn't met came to find him. Some were straightforwardly technical. They had specific questions about the geometry, about the scale-up data, about the patent claims. He answered them all. The man from the sixth row found him near the coffee station and introduced himself as Dr. Gerald Park, 22 years in aerospace thermal systems, currently consulting for 2 national research laboratories. The benchmark data from your scale-up trials, Dr. Park said. The 22% efficiency improvement over threshold. I want to run that against our lab's modeling framework. I can send you the full data set. James Chen from Veridian can connect you with the simulation outputs. I'm not interested in Veridian simulations. I want your original physical test data, the 214 cycles. Ryan looked at him. Why specifically the original data? Dr. Park's expression was the precise, unhurried expression of a man saying something he'd thought through. Because simulation results tell you what the model predicts. Your physical test data tells you what actually happened. At 214 cycles, in a residential garage with salvaged equipment, with no institutional error correction infrastructure. He paused. If it holds up in those conditions, it's robust. I want to see the raw data. Ryan gave him his email address. Dr. Park entered it into his phone with the deliberate care of someone for whom contact information was not casually handled. Mr. Walker, he said before walking away. I've been to a lot of these. A slight gesture at the conference around them. I don't often hear something genuinely new. He walked away. Ryan stood with his coffee and the particular weight of that sentence and let it settle. Later, after the formal sessions had ended and the conference center was emptying into the early evening, Ryan found Emma sitting in one of the lobby chairs with her notebook open, writing something. He sat down next to her. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her sentence first, which he appreciated. What are you writing? He said. Notes. She looked up. From the presentation, I wrote down the parts I wanted to remember. What parts? She looked at her notebook. The part about how living things move heat, and the part about the wrong version of the problem. She paused. And the part at the end where you said what you are. He was quiet for a second. Why that part? He said. Emma considered the question the way she always considered real questions, with actual thought, not automatic response. Because you said it like it was just true, not like it was something you were ashamed of or something you were proud of. Just true. She looked at him. I think that was the best part of the whole thing. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, with her notebook and her too small flannel jacket and the pencil she held like she'd always held it, slightly too tightly, a habit he'd noticed when she was 5 and had never corrected because it didn't seem worth correcting. Yeah, he said. I think so too. Sophia found them there. She had her coat on, the tablet under her arm, the day's compressed energy beginning to decompress into the quieter version of herself that Ryan had only seen a few times, usually at the end of long, demanding days when the professional performance of certainty could ease off slightly. She sat down across from them. Dr. Park wants the raw data, Ryan said. I know. James told me. Gerald Park is one of the best thermal engineers alive. She looked at Ryan with the direct, unsentimental focus he'd learned meant she was saying something she meant. He doesn't say genuinely new to people he's trying to be polite to. Ryan nodded. There's something else, Sophia said. She set the tablet on the chair beside her, a deliberate gesture he'd learned that meant what she was about to say wasn't coming from the tablet. We got a preliminary inquiry this afternoon, during the session actually. One of the research directors from the National Aerospace Development Initiative was in the room. Ryan was still. They want a formal meeting, Sophia said, about the thermal pathway technology. Not just the propulsion application, the broader potential. What this geometry could do in satellite thermal management, in next-generation aircraft systems, in long-duration space applications. Emma looked up from her notebook. Ryan looked at Sophia. He looked at the conference center around them, emptying now. The remaining people in the clusters and pairs of end-of-day conversation. He looked at the morning's program still folded in his jacket pocket, his name on the speaker list between two people with PhDs and institutional affiliations. When? He said. They want a schedule within 6 weeks. They'll come to the facility. A pause. Ryan, I want to be careful about how I say this because I don't want to overstate something that isn't finalized. But what happened today, combined with the project results we're going to deliver in the next 2 months, this is the kind of moment where things change, not just for Viridian, for the technology, for what it becomes. He sat with that. The weight of it was real, not oppressive, but real. The particular weight of something that has grown larger than you initially understood it to be. He'd built a system in a garage. He'd built it from salvaged parts and notebook calculations, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the problem didn't have a solution. And now the system was going to satellite thermal management and long-duration space applications in a meeting with the National Aerospace Development Initiative. He thought about the scholarship. The Tuesday in September he'd been going to move into the dormitories, the 2 textbooks and the calculator he still owned and still used, the wall that had been a door. He thought about his father, who had called him the engineer in the family, back when there was still reason to use that description without qualification. His father had died 4 years ago, quietly, in the same town he'd been born in, having spent most of his life in a garage not entirely unlike the one Ryan now occupied. They had not talked in those last years about the engineering Ryan was doing at night when the town was asleep. His father had known about the notebooks. He'd given Ryan the habit of them, in a way, the same systematic documentation, the same compulsion to write things down, but they hadn't talked about what was in them. He wished, sitting in the conference center lobby with his daughter and the woman who had spent 7 months finding him, that his father could have known about today. Not to prove anything, there had never been anything to prove between them. His father had been the one person in Cedar Creek who had never once implied that Ryan's work was lesser than it should have been. Just to share it. The way you want to share something real with the person who helped you understand what real meant. He didn't say any of this out loud. Okay, he said to Sophia. Set up the meeting. She nodded. She picked up the tablet. The day's last business, compact and settled. Good presentation, she said with the directness she always used. No decorative language, no excessive praise, just the assessment. Good projector research, he said. Her expression moved in the direction of a smile. That was Kira. I know. She left. Ryan sat with Emma in the emptying lobby, the evening light coming through the conference center's large windows, the city outside doing its city things. Emma had gone back to her notebook. He watched her write without reading what she was writing. She had her father's compulsion, the documentation instinct, the need to get things down before they slipped away. He'd need to get back to Cedar Creek tomorrow. The garage didn't run itself, and there were 2 cars waiting for him. A 2016 Honda Civic with a transmission issue and a truck whose owner had called twice about the timing belt. Normal work. The ordinary infrastructure of the life he'd built and would keep building. He was glad about that, actually. He'd thought about it in the weeks after signing the contract. Whether the Viridian work, the scale-up project, the increased pace and stakes of everything would make the garage feel small. Whether the comparison would diminish it. Whether he would start looking at oil changes and tire rotations the way he'd sometimes looked at his garage through Cedar Creek's eyes, as insufficient, as less than. He didn't feel that. The garage was the garage. It was where the work had started and where his hands knew how to be useful and where Emma had grown up watching him take broken things seriously. The Viridian work existed because of the garage, not in spite of it. These were not 2 different lives in conflict. They were the same life at different scales. He thought about this for a while. About scales. About the way the same geometric principle, distribute the load, don't route everything through a single critical path, appeared in thermal systems and in how you lived. Don't put everything through one channel. Spread it. Let the redundancy work for you. He was aware this was the kind of thought that sounded like wisdom when you were tired at the end of a significant day and should probably be checked against ordinary morning logic before you committed to it. He wrote it in the margin of the conference program anyway. He could check it later. 6 weeks after the symposium, Ryan sat at a conference table in Viridian's facility outside Boston, across from 3 people from the National Aerospace Development Initiative, and they talked about his work for 4 hours. He brought the 12th notebook. He answered every question without apologizing for what he knew or didn't know. When he didn't know something, he said so, which they appeared to find more useful than the alternative. At the end of the 4 hours, the senior director, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Adeyeze Chukwu, who had the bearing of someone who had been deciding what was worth serious attention for a very long time, leaned back in her chair and looked at Ryan with the specific consideration of someone who had arrived at a conclusion. "Mr. Walker," she said, "we're going to want to formalize this relationship. The specific terms will take time to work out, and I won't overstate where we are in the process, but I want to be direct with you. What you've developed has implications that go beyond the current propulsion application." She paused. "Significantly beyond?" Ryan looked at her. "How significantly?" "We have satellite thermal management programs that have been running at suboptimal efficiency for a decade because we couldn't solve the high-temperature bottleneck problem your geometry addresses. We have long-duration mission planning that's been constrained by thermal limitations in the life support systems. We have—" She stopped. "I'll put it this way. We've been looking for this solution for a long time. We didn't find it inside the system." The table was quiet for a moment. "I'll take that under advisement," Ryan said. Sophia, sitting beside him, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Dr. Chukwu's expression moved. "You have a dry sense of humor, Mr. Walker." "I've been told." She offered her hand across the table. He shook it. He drove back to Cedar Creek that afternoon, alone this time. Emma was in school, Sophia had a board meeting, the Viridian team had their own afternoon. The highway was clear, and the early summer light was the good kind, the kind that makes the ordinary landscape look like something worth looking at. He pulled into his driveway at 4:30. The garage door was where he'd left it, slightly warped, sticking the way it did in humid weather. He got out of the truck and opened the door and stood in the entrance for a moment. The utility light was on, casting its permanent yellow across the workbench. The 13th notebook was open to the page where he'd left off. The temperature gauge read ambient. He went inside. He made coffee, actual coffee, with attention, remembering to drink it while it was hot. He stood at the workbench and looked at what was there. The prototype, the notebooks, the data logs in their box, the salvaged components on the shelves, the copper tubing coiled like it had always been coiled, the water stain on the ceiling that he had finally, 2 weeks ago, actually done something about. It was smaller now, treated with sealant, not gone, but not growing. He thought about the woman in the back row who'd asked about his background. Where did this come from? He'd answered with the facts. A mechanic, a garage, salvaged materials, 11 notebooks. He'd said it like it was just true, and Emma had said that was the best part. The best part of any story, he thought, was usually the part where someone stops managing how it sounds and just says what happened. This had happened. He had built a thing alone in a garage that nobody took seriously, and the building had taken years, and the years had cost him. And the cost had been specific and real, and sometimes in the small hours of the morning had felt like more than the work was worth. He'd gotten the dates wrong sometimes, the calculations wrong, the materials wrong, the strategy wrong. He'd been dismissed and overlooked and politely condescended to by people who were wrong about him, and more importantly, wrong about what the dismissal was costing both of them. He had not been without doubt. He had not been without fear. He had not been a man who was certain of his eventual vindication, sustained by some unshakable conviction that the world would come around. He had just kept working. That was the whole story, stripped down. Not inspiration, not destiny, not the version that resolves everything into a lesson. Just a man and a problem, and the stubborn, specific refusal to stop engaging with it when every rational signal said, "This is not worth your time." He didn't know what the next 2 years would look like. The NADI meetings, the broader applications, the questions that would follow the symposium paper when it was published, which Kira had already started preparing with a focus that suggested it would be the most thoroughly cited submission in the journal's history. He didn't know how large it would get or how complicated, what new walls would turn out to be doors and which ones would just be walls. He knew the garage. He knew the notebooks. He knew that Emma would be home at 3:22 and that she would notice immediately if the temperature gauge reading was different from this morning's,
and that she would ask him what had happened at the NADI meeting with the particular intensity of a kid who had decided this was her story too. It was her story too. It had always been. He heard the school bus at 3:20. He heard her footsteps on the driveway, the rhythm of them, the specific weight and pace he could identify in the dark. The garage door opened. Emma stood in the doorway with her backpack at full extension and her too small flannel jacket and her notebook already out. She looked at him. She looked at the temperature gauge. She looked at the 13th notebook open on the bench. "Well," she said. He picked up his coffee. He drank it while it was still warm. "Come in," he said. "I'll tell you everything." She came in. The garage door closed behind her. Outside, Cedar Creek was doing what Cedar Creek did. The afternoon light on the ordinary streets, the small sounds of a small town going about its life, largely unchanged. Inside, the utility light cast its yellow across the workbench and the notebooks and the two of them, the same as it had on 1,000 evenings before this one. He told her everything. She listened to all of it, her pencil moving in her notebook, getting it down. The details, the words, the numbers, the things that mattered. She had always been a person who paid attention. She had learned it here, in this garage, watching her father take broken things seriously on the off chance that they contained something worth saving. He had been right about that, it turned out. More often than not, they did.